Okay, welcome to the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform Committee's 6th meeting of 2020. Before we move to the first item on the agenda, can I remind everyone to switch their mobile phones off or put them on silent as they affect the broadcasting system. Our first item is to decide whether to take agenda items 4 and 5. That's the consideration of the evidence on the Committee for Climate Change Annual Progress Report and on Scottish Water Investment Plan in private. Are we agreed to do that? Thank you. Right, our second item is to hear from the Committee for Climate Change on its annual progress report. And I'm delighted to welcome our 3 colleagues here today. We've got Chris Stark, Chief Executive, Professor Keith Bell, Member, and Tom Andrews, Senior Analyst from the Committee on Climate Change. Good morning to you all. We've got a good 90 minutes, so as I've just been saying to my colleagues, it seems like a lot, but we've got an awful lot to cover. We will obviously be asking you lots of questions and getting your feedback on things, but there'll probably be quite a lot that we actually don't manage to cover, so we'll probably be following up with quite a lot of other questions based on how the conversation goes, but I'm sure you're prepared for that. I'd like to ask, first of all, and start things off by talking about the progress that Scotland has made to date. And just your sort of assessment on the direction of travel, maybe taking into that some of the sort of like signifiers that we've seen maybe in the budget towards looking at addressing emissions.
First of all, good morning. Thank you for having us. And let me begin that question by reflecting on what you've just said, actually, that Scotland is clearly making good efforts now to do the things that will need to be done to get to net zero, and that is something to be celebrated. We haven't yet seen that in the numbers. So actually, Tom, why don't, if you could give us a quick update on where we are on the numbers, and then perhaps we can reflect on the actions underneath that.
Yep, so the most latest kind of data that we have for Scotland is 2017. There's a kind of 2-year lag built into the process of collecting those statistics. In that year, emissions were roughly half what they were in 1990, 47% lower than 1990 levels, at 40.5 megatons. It's a 3% fall in the year. If you look at the trend over the last decade, it's very positive. Scotland's seen a big reduction in its annual emissions, but almost all of that is to do with the power sector. So that has seen more or less the entire phase out of fossil fuel-fired electricity generation in Scotland, which we think is excellent. But it means that if Scotland is going to continue to make progress, that transition needs to then move to other sectors across the economy. Transport in particular, we would see as being one sector where the trend is going the wrong way. It's increased year on year for the last 4 years. And when including aviation and shipping as well, it accounts for nearly 2/5 of emissions in Scotland today.
And just to reflect a bit on that, I suppose the story that tells you is that Scotland, slightly ahead of the rest of the UK, has completed the first chapter of what needs to be done, and in particular on the power sector. And with coal, you can see that reflected in the stats that we're using in this report. And now we need to look to a different set of stories. And from my perspective, that's why the recent budget was a good development. So we're now moving on to the stories in all the other sectors as we would know them. But we haven't, of course, yet seen the update to the climate change plan, which is, I think, the really big moment this year. So in our report last year, we are, it feels like a bit of a staging post for us. So we are, reflecting on that story that Tom told of the closure of coal, the really positive story on the power sector, and trying to tee up, I suppose, what needs to happen in those other sectors. And the budget was, I suppose, part one of that, but I'm excited about what might come next.
To actually talking and getting your views on what we think should be in the climate change plan, but bring in Finlay first of all.
Good morning. It's great to be able to have really ambitious targets and celebrate that, and that's what everybody would want. But realistically, greenhouse gas emissions fell only by 3%, and net measurement was actually increased by 4%, and that's in comparison to a 10% fall in 2016. And you've already said that Scotland's reduction in emissions were mostly down to a closure of coal-fired electricity generation. So are we getting a bit of bravado here? Is Scotland really doing as well as we're led to believe when these figures would suggest it's going to be incredibly difficult to reach the targets in 2020, never mind the 75% reduction by 2030?
I mean, I think that I've been called many things, but I'm not sure I've been accused of bravado before. But that's it. I mean, I think Scotland is doing well. But I think you're absolutely, the kind of premise of your question is the right one. So we are, we can't rely now on that one sector to keep delivering these emissions reductions. And what's next is really hard. So there's a set of really challenging policy questions that lie outside of the power sector that will be difficult, I should say, for Scotland alone to address, given the fact that some of the powers are reserved. But I think I'm very happy to say that even at the level of ambition we've seen in the recent budget, we are not yet at a place where we can say that we have the right prescription for net zero overall in Scotland. I don't know whether you agree, Keith.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's clear that we've banked those emissions reductions from the closure of coal, so you can't close it again. Doesn't mean to say the power sector is finished. There's a big contribution to the whole of the UK's reduction coming from that. Obviously, buildings and transport are the big things. As Tom highlighted, transport emissions actually have gone up, so there's major things to be addressed there. But the energy use in buildings is, I think, one of the big things, and land use. I mean, obviously, we produced the land use report not very long ago. That raises some big questions. I mean, it's a good time to raise those questions in a way, with reflections of what comes after the Common Agricultural Policy, and thinking about the land as providing kind of public goods as well as private goods in terms of crops and so on. So that has to be seen in the round. Gives major opportunities actually to reform policy, not just in respect of greenhouse gas emissions, reductions, but also biodiversity and the kind of the way in which good management of land is funded as well.
I would say, I mean, come back to the budget, there was a big announcement about peatland restoration in the budget, which if you saw any of the evidence from the Cabinet Secretary last week, she was tremendously excited about. How significant is that?
I think it is quite significant. I mean, peatland restoration alone isn't going to get us to net zero, but it is one of those areas where you get what you might call a quick win. So I think it's really good to see the Scottish Government funding that. That's something that, in my time in appearing before this committee, we've been talking about for a long time. So that is to be celebrated again. I would like to see more of those sorts of announcements come through, because there are strongly positive impacts of that, not just to the climate. So, we can see that that kind of ambition is the kind of thing we need to see written right through the Scottish Government's programme if we're to meet net zero. But it's worth saying that even the peatland restoration programme that was announced in that budget could be built upon still further, so that there are always opportunities to go further, and that's one of them.
Okay. Right, we're going to actually address the targets. Mark, you've got some questions on that, and then we'll come in to talk about the climate change plan.
Yeah, morning to everybody. Chris, I think on the radio a few weeks ago, you'd said that talk of world-leading targets is cheap. I just wondered if you'd like to expand on that.
Well, I obviously stand by it, but put simply, it's easy to set a target. It's much harder to meet it. So, the target that we have in the UK, the 2045 net zero target, is in effect the same target as the UK's 2050 target. It's just a measure of the progress that Scotland needs to make if the UK as a whole is to meet net zero by 2050. I am delighted that we have net zero targets across the UK, and I'm very pleased that we have a net zero target of 2045 here in Scotland. What is needed now is the actions that will move us swiftly towards delivering it, and that's in the end all that matters. I'm content that that target is used by the Scottish Government as a measure of its own ambition, but you can expect that what the Committee on Climate Change will look at more and more now is the progress towards that target rather than the target itself. So that was what I was trying to get at when I said cheap.
So in terms then of meeting the 2030 target, that all-important action that we need to take in the next 10 years, what are the areas where you feel we're currently not on the right trajectory and we need to up the ambition? Which areas do you feel that with continued progress we're going to meet 2030 and then use that as a springboard for 2045?
Well, you will find them in every single sector. So each sector has a different story of what needs to happen. So I don't want to give you the impression that the power sector is done. So we've talked about power sector. We may well have significantly decarbonised it, but now we need to very significantly grow the amount of electricity that is being generated without carbon. The one I will highlight here is the one that Keith raised just a minute ago, is the land use sector, land use and agriculture, which is an area where most of the policies are devolved and the responsibilities lie in this Parliament. So that's an area where Scotland needs to pick up the pace of emissions reduction and has the capacity to do so. Transport, Tom has raised already. Again, that's fundamentally a question of what we do, in particular about surface transport. We do have options for replacing the petrol and diesel vehicles on our roads, but if that's the strategy alone, it's not the right one. We have to think about how we cut demand for transport that makes use of cars. You know, we are driving excessively at the moment on our roads. And the biggest one of all is, and I think the hardest challenge of all, is what we do about domestic heat, which is by and large still fossil fuelled. We have a good set of options for how we decarbonise the housing stock here in Scotland and across the UK, but we haven't got the full comprehensive plan that would get us there. It's on that one that I might just like to say a bit more, that I think Scotland really is setting the template for the rest of the UK on what to do about that, in particular, and how to address and improve the energy efficiency of the building stock here in Scotland. That is fantastic. What we need alongside that now is a comprehensive strategy for decarbonising the heat for those buildings, and that's the bit where we haven't yet seen the progress that we need to. That's something for the Scottish Government to worry about. It's also something for our colleagues in the UK Government.
And do you think the balance is right between investment in energy efficiency on one side and decarbonisation of fuel source on the other?
That's a very good question. I'm not sure I can answer it. I can say that given the set of devolved levers available to the Scottish Government and this Parliament, I think we are now seeing the right kind of emphasis on energy efficiency that we need. That's something that we've been making a lot of down south. You know, we can point now to the Scottish prescription for improving energy efficiency of the building stock here in Scotland, and that looks like a really good recipe across the UK. I don't think we are nearly close to having the right kind of investment in decarbonised heat that we will need. There is a window to address that and to put good plans in place, and I hope we take it.
But I mean, there was 50 million announced in the draft budget. Is that enough then?
No.
To get us? No.
No. It's again, it's a good start, but it's not enough. It's not at the right sort of scale.
Okay. And in terms of the 2020 target, I mean, that's where we're at today, isn't it? Is there a risk that we don't meet that?
There is a risk, of course, that we might meet it, that we might not meet it. I suppose the thing to say about it, we're sitting at, Tom, 51% reduction on 1990 levels at the moment?
Yeah, so the target itself is measured against an adjusted inventory. So to account for year-on-year changes to the methodology, you compare the target year to the, more or less compare it to the inventory that was present in the year in which the target was set. So it makes Scotland's kind of target progress a little bit more resilient to that. So in real terms, and kind of the most recent picture of what we think has happened to emissions in Scotland, that's a 47% reduction on 1990 levels. Against the kind of target setting inventory, that would be a 51% reduction, which means between 2017 and 2020, you need to find 5 percentage points of additional reduction. It's that kind of timescale means that things that are happening now in this year are more likely to have an impact on whether that target is met or not, rather than whether there's been big structural change in Scotland. So the mild winter that we've seen at the start of 2020, for example, will have an impact. The amount of economic output, the amount that people are flying this year, are the kinds of things that will determine whether or not that target is met.
Yeah.
So we would say, while the 2020 target is really important, and we will report on it, and we hope that it's met, the long-term focus is the really crucial thing to look at, because that will allow us to kind of measure whether or not progress is being made in any real sense.
Yeah. And then the 2030 75%, with the changes in the revisions to the inventory, that will be closer to 83%. That's my understanding. Is that right? So is that due to the changing inventory around wetlands?
Well, that 75% will already account for those things. So we recommended in our net zero report a 70% target in that year for 2030, and that was based on a trajectory that included those inventory revisions that accounted for things like peatlands and for global warming potentials being updated in line with IPCC guidance. Peatland will undoubtedly make that target look harder because it's effectively a block of emissions that aren't currently on the inventory that will be added, and you then need to start doing additional abatement on top of that. It will be a challenging target to meet.
Very challenging target to meet. So I mean, the 2030 target, which is a 75% target, is extremely challenging. I mean, really, really extremely challenging. I don't know how much I can emphasise it. So I mean, Scotland's halved its emissions in the last 30 years. That has been, you know, that's been quite a slog. This new target would require us to have them again in the next decade. And just as Tom says, we did in the net zero report mention a 70% target. That was based on a straight line pathway between now to net zero. We need to do the work to look at what the whole pathway would look like. It may end up looking like a straight line, it may not. So it will depend really on the extent to which you can front load emissions reduction. And the front loading options that we had 30 years ago aren't there now. So power sector emissions are not going to fall again, just as Keith said. So achieving that 75% target is extremely difficult. It is a target that Parliament has set, but it's not done so on the basis of detailed technical advice. So that's something that we will return to in our own advice when we offer advice on the full UK pathway later this year.
Okay. So that will look at individual sectors and the changing emissions inventories.
It's my ambition that this year, for the first time, we build a set of sectoral pathways right out to net zero. So we haven't been able to do that yet. Okay. And that will allow us then to look at the sectoral pathways here in Scotland too. If you can imagine the work that we've done to date actually does look, if you look at UK level, it does look like a straight line, but beneath that you've got a set of much more interesting sectoral pathways taking place. It's just the kind of law of large numbers gets you to that straight line overall. I don't know whether that will be the case looking forward. That's something that frankly, I'm excited to find out. So it's something that we're looking at now.
Great, yeah,
But people need to brace themselves for the outcome of that, because as you say, 70% was the guidance that was given by yourselves.
Yeah.
It's the conversation's going to have to turn away from targets and onto what that actually translates.
Well, I absolutely think targets keep us on track. I mean, what matters between now and achieving net zero is the area under the curve. So, you know, the more that you can bring it down quickly, the better that is for the climate. But the targets that we have, the interim targets here in Scotland, and the carbon budgets, as I know at UK level, are your guide. So they present the glide path to net zero overall. They should be set on the right path to make them achievable, feasible and ambitious. That requires us to look carefully, this is why you have a CCC, to look carefully at what needs to be done in each sector and to build that sectoral pathway to allow us to set that target overall. But just as you say, what really matters is the actions to deliver it, not the target itself. And this is the year, I think, when the CCC as an institution will move beyond looking at those targets as being our major focus into delivery and action. It seems to me that it follows that we should be moving away from the targets and onto the actions themselves and becoming, if we can, the independent experts on what works.
Claudia.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning to you all. That is working. Could I just push a bit further in discussion about the 2030 target? And I hold my hand up to being the person who, the amendment, as you know, it happened to be in my name, but it was across the parties that it was agreed. I mean, to be clear about it, I was absolutely clear that I greatly respect, of course, the work of your committee. There's also, in the balance in pushing for that 75% target, there was the IPP see recommendation that there should be rapid transformational change, and there were also a number of other reports, such as vivid economic reports that were coming out, and a range of different reports and developing research. And I'm a layperson. However, I do also, as well as the technicalities of it, I believe in the political drive and also in the possibilities within all the sectors to inspire and also oblige. So, I mean, you say it will be, I think you said it will be extremely difficult or even more, very
It's a terrible contortion of words.
Yes. What, I suppose I'm very interested to know how soon you, or if indeed you will be able to help us with sectoral targets and behaviour change proposals on that target, you know, and when that might be available.
So just lots of things to say about that. My worry about the target isn't that we shouldn't have ambitious targets, it's that we should have targets that can be meaningfully achieved. So there's a number of factors in that. You know, the quicker we cut emissions, the better for the climate. So there's an obvious point here that having an ambitious target helps with that, at least it should do. My worry is that it might be a bridge too far. So that's the concern here. And just to qualify that statement, the reason I say that isn't because I feel we shouldn't have you know, a drive to cutting emissions in as fast a way as possible. It's that some of the elements of achieving that target don't sit with the Scottish Government. So, you know, if it's vastly out of kilter with what the UK as a whole is trying to achieve, and some of, in particular, the big energy infrastructure questions will not keep pace with it, and you may well get to the point where to meet that target, you have to do things that are what economists might call suboptimal. That is, they may not stick, so they might not be the right actions overall. My main it's a plea to the whole of the Scottish Parliament actually is to wait to see what this looks like. So there will be you can expect as you should rather from the CCC a huge amount of ambition in the way that we view what needs to happen over the next 3 decades, and in particular a huge amount of ambition about the steps that need to be put in place over the next decade. You know, some of that will have big and deep connotations for what can be achieved in Scotland. In particular, you could think about things like the gas grid. So the future of the gas grid, that's a very obvious place to look for, you know, an opportunity to cut emissions here in Scotland. I don't know what the UK strategy as a whole will be for closing or indeed keeping open that gas grid over the next 10 to 20 years, but I do know it's very significant in the Scottish story. So my worry is that you have a target that can't be met, and therefore you undermine the whole framework here in Scotland for cutting emissions overall. And there are...
Chris, I think either it's setting up for failure and the kind of political disadvantages that brings, or in striving so hard to meet that target, you close off options that might be better for the longer term. So a particular question there is about what, yeah, as Chris said, what happens to the future of gas? To what extent does hydrogen replace methane in meeting energy needs, either through, you know, fuel cells in heavy goods vehicles? That seems to have to happen at some point, but there's the heat in buildings question. So in certain locations where you might have a kind of the ability to manufacture hydrogen in a blue or green way, you could achieve that perhaps in the late 2030s through into the 2040s. So looking at a 2050 kind of situation, that might look like the best way to go. But if actually, in order to meet a 2030 target, you've electrified a lot more, even more. There's been a lot of electrification anyway. You know, you might kind of sort of regret having done that. Although, you know, sort of hybrid solutions in the interim may well be the way to kind of get through that sort of situation. But then there's a further replacement of capital stock associated with that. But as Chris said, there are big questions about the gas network and what happens to it. Or gas networks, I think we might say, because we could see different solutions in different places.
But we are where we are, and I take it that your recommendations will help us in assessing what would be suboptimal ways if we're looking beyond 2030 as well, you know, for the whole trajectory.
Yeah, I mean,
and also arriving at 2030.
If I can put it this way, the next decade is the most important decade because this is the place where we need to put the right conditions in place to then deliver it. So, you know, that I would love to see Scotland be as ambitious as it can over those next 10 years. Some of those things lie firmly in the gift of this Parliament. Some of them lie elsewhere. So I think it's perfectly acceptable for Scotland to have as ambitious a plan as it can on cutting emissions, and to have a position for the things that it would like to see happen in Westminster too. But some of that will depend on decisions taken outside of Scotland. So we've got to measure those things and balance them out. My interest really is in providing for you as much clarity as possible about what things need to be done, in particular over the next 10 years. So we are looking in the work that we're doing at the moment at what's known as the 6th carbon budget for the UK. That takes us into a period 2033 to 37. It's a very important moment for us as the committee, but also in setting that target, because it's the first of the interim targets at UK level that will have been set after the net zero goal has been set. And for us, this is the major UK-wide target that will determine the path of emissions between now and 2050 for the UK. That will then have implications for Scotland too. Now, it would be fine for us simply to recommend a level for the 6th carbon budget in September, but actually it's not very interesting. I think I'm much more interested in spelling out the conditions that need to be in place to achieve it. We are looking at that as a very scenario-based exercise. What we're looking at is the mixture of behaviours and technologies that would be necessary to cut emissions as quickly as possible, and then we can draw from that what the Scottish story looks like, and we can even play around with that so that Scotland starts earlier in some of those elements, so that there's a great deal of detail we'll be able to provide at the end of this, which should be very helpful, I hope.
I'm going to move on to, we have alluded to the climate change plan many times throughout the conversation that we've had. And it's obvious that the climate change plan, as it is right now, is not sufficient in terms of the new targets that we've got. So we won't have to go over that. But in terms of you mentioned the priorities for action, particularly around heating of homes and transport, and the difficulties that there are because there are reserved areas there that will impact upon both of those. But in terms of what we can do in the Scottish Government and Parliament setting, I think first of all I'd like to ask you to help us in a way. We have made it very clear in our recommendations that considerations around net zero shouldn't just lie in silos, shouldn't just lie in this committee, that's this portfolio of government. I would like to know your view on how we can embed net zero across portfolios, not just in terms of government action, but also in parliamentary scrutiny as well, and how important that is in actually realising some of this ambition.
I might kick it off, and Keith, chip in if you've got any reflections on it. So, one of the most interesting things that's happened since we reported last year on the net zero, in the net zero report that led to the setting of the target that Scotland now has, is something I hadn't really predicted, and that was the signalling impact of net zero. So we used to have an 80% target here in Scotland, and it always left open the question, am I in the 20? And so when we recommended a net zero target last year, we were clear it was the right target, but I think we underestimated the impact it might have as a signal and as a sort of call to arms, if you like. It follows from that I think everyone in the system now recognises that they have a part to play in reducing emissions, and that's fantastic from my perspective. But just as I very much agree with the way you framed that question. It will not be achieved if we look at it solely as a set of siloed questions about how to cut emissions. Some of the steps to achieve net zero overall are what you might call system-wide challenges. So the domestic heat one, which we've talked about a lot, is a good example of that. That involves good, strong housing policy and a set of energy policies to get there, but crucially also a set of steps to keep the consumer or the citizen well informed of what's going to happen and engaged in the process of delivering it. That doesn't happen by the Housing Directorate of the Scottish Government setting a policy. It happens by a set of strong leadership from our politicians here in the UK and strong policies right across the system to deliver it. You see those system-wide challenges everywhere. So just to highlight one that we feel is particularly important, the land use challenge. So to get to net zero, we know we have to change the use of land across the UK and here in Scotland. That rests, interestingly enough, on, from my perspective, fascinating question, on diet. You know, the extent to which you can shift the use of what's presently traditional agricultural land to something else rests in part, and quite a large part, on what we are consuming and what we eat. These big system challenges need to be viewed as such. So we need an integrated plan that looks right across all of the sectors and picks out these things and makes good, strong plans for the next 25 years, not for the next parliamentary term. And I suppose, from my perspective, that's the opportunity in the coming update to the climate change plan and in the eventual new climate change plan that we'll see thereafter, is that the Act here in Scotland and across the UK requires those kind of long-term systemic plans to be put in place, and that will necessarily need to look out beyond any one parliamentary administration. So I suppose, going back to my earlier point, this is the opportunity to put those conditions in place so we get the right outcome. Do you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. And in some ways, the sectoral pathways don't necessarily help in that respect of making clear these kind of interactions. So they are really important reference points to see what's going on and what the outcomes of policies need to be. But to deliver those outcomes, there's a different set of combinations that are needed. So, you know, Chris mentioned a whole bunch of things to do with reducing greenhouse gas emissions associated with use of heat. And I would add another one, a really important one to that list, which is skills. So, you know, we're talking about, you know, a lot of heat pumps being installed, for example. And unlike a lot of the market for heat pumps that exist globally, which are air-to-air heat pumps, we're talking a lot of air-to-water heat pumps to fit in with existing heating systems within buildings, and that in turn requires the right kind of setting up and specification of the systems and installed in the right way. So that body of expertise to install has to be in place, and it has to be in place from the beginning, otherwise consumer confidence will not be built up. Once people see it and get used to using it, and, you know, the word spreads about how it all happens, then we can get that momentum established. And, you know, setting an ambitious target helps to kind of set the momentum that we want to achieve, but it has to be backed up by appropriate budgets in all of these areas. And unfortunately, there's another element of cost there in making sure that these things are provided. But the teaching has to be right. The curriculum has to include the right things. It's in a slightly Cinderella sector of education, which is FE colleges to a very large extent. And then the installations have to be checked, that they have actually worked. So there's another kind of, you know, a cost in supporting, going and evaluating that things have been installed in the right way. You know, a major part of advice from the CCC recently has been no new homes on the gas grid from 2025, and here we're talking about 2024. That's very good. You can imagine the big housing developers, you know, they're going to build things as, you know, at least cost. So the regulations have to be appropriate, but then we have to test they have actually met the regulation. That means a random sampling, not just being led to the one demo house and saying, oh, yeah, everything looks fine. You know, this kind of thing. So that has to be, like I say, these sorts of things have to be embedded across different areas of policy. It's never, I'm not sure how you structure it in terms of, you know, committees looking at this, that and the other and whatever government departments there are. I mean, at least here in Scotland, the government departments have the opportunity to talk to each other, I think, more than they do in Whitehall. And that should be of great benefit. But the resources to see that the policy is actually delivered and to verify can't be underestimated, really.
Talking about the climate change plan and how specific your recommendations in the climate change plan should be, and how, if they're too high level, how, you know, we have to make sure that they are filtering down through that system. So in terms of, like, you know, advice from yourself, and obviously, Chris, you were involved in the last climate change plan in the Scottish Government.
Excellent plan.
Well, yeah. but you know, how can this plan be meaningful and actionable?
It's fabulous doing the job I do for many reasons, but one of the reasons I like this job so much is that we have a pretty unique role of. People think we forecast, but we don't actually. We hindcast. So we stand in the future and look back. So what you get from the CCC is, by law, the requirement for us to have looked at the world where we've achieved the target, now a net zero target, and we look back to where we are today, and we can spell out what looks like the kind of path of least resistance to achieving it. And when you do that, actually, it's not as complicated as it might appear. So, you know, getting to the goal of net zero overall involves, in every sector, a fairly clear set of steps. How you achieve them is, I suppose, the interesting question. But broadly, in almost every sector, it's about getting to actually zero emissions, bar a couple, aviation being one and agriculture being the other. Now, that clarity of thought should really be driven right through the climate change plan. And what I would be looking for is something that sets out how we will get from here to there in each sector with that genuinely integrated view. So, you know, you can play around with the dates by which you achieve some of those actual zero emission goals. And you can certainly play around with the actions necessary to achieve it. But in the end, we've got to get there. So the kind of clarity that comes with net zero, it should make it easier to make a plan, is I suppose the central point I'm trying to make.
So the linkages between the sectors and the impact of one sector and another and all the rest of it is happening in the background. But in terms of actually having an actionable plan, you actually have to be quite specific.
You do. And it's worth saying that the 2018 plan was a really good level of detail, and that's very necessary. It certainly helps us in the task of appraising it. But I do want to make the point again that net zero is a more fundamental target. It therefore means we need to lean more heavily on those big system challenges. And I'm so pleased Keith raised skills, because that's a really good example of something that wouldn't jump out at you if you only looked at emission reductions in isolation. There are these kind of big system-wide challenges that need to be viewed in that way. Skills provision is one, how we use land is another, engaging with the public might be another one. There's a whole set of the kind of economic challenges and just transition challenges that run through it too. So I would like the plan to look at those things alongside that very specific level of detail.
And thank you for Keith to have given some grist to my mill that colleges are the most important sector. As a former FE lecturer, I've been saying that for decades. Claudia.
Thank you. I had a couple of quite quick questions about the updated climate change plan. I did want to highlight that I had intended to ask about whether you're going to do a skills assessment strategy, which is perhaps broader than the updated climate change plan, but in terms of what you're talking about, Chris, and the systems analysis of right across all sectors, and are you able to do something that will...
I mean, I don't want to overcommit, but that's definitely something we're thinking about now. So in particular, if you imagine, if I just expand a bit on what I said earlier, this is probably one of the last moments when setting a target will really have a big impact. So, you know, we are thinking a lot about that in the committee too. So as we move beyond setting targets and into actually what drives action, these barriers to action jump out at you, and skills provision is definitely one of them. We've seen, in particular at UK level, some pretty bad examples of pulling away policies that actually have a hugely damaging impact. The most obvious one is this net zero homes commitment that the then Secretary of State for Housing pulled at the very last minute at UK level. That was damaging, not just because we no longer had the target, but because there was an industry being built up to deliver it, and then, you know, almost overnight, that disappeared. I would like the committee, my committee, to look more at those things and to be able to present advice on what needs to be done to build the kind of capacity to deliver net zero. And necessarily some of that is cross-sectoral.
I think maybe adding as well, it's also at different layers of government. So we've talked about UK and how actually Scottish targets, to some extent, to a large extent, are dependent on UK actions. There's a lot, of course, that Scottish government can do, but there's also local authorities. And the interactions there and the clarity of policies and where the kind of actions sit, and kind of underpinning that, the funding and so on. So it's a challenge, of course, to kind of get those interactions right, but they have to be got right. And yeah.
I've got two other questions, but I'll ask them both at once because I know other members have questions on this area and others. You'll know, Chris, that there was a progression with peatlands, and we're in a much better place, well, a very good place compared to where we were. I'm going to ask you whether you see, I'm going to put it in a positive way rather than negative way, whether you see the opportunities for blue carbon and marine issues as something that you'll be looking at for the updated plan or indeed for future plans. And then my other question is, we're going to have an updated plan, and I feel some confusion in my own mind about how when we've got a budget that we're working on now before the plan, how it will be possible for the Scottish Government, or indeed any government, UK government, to actually, not the UK government in this case, I don't want to confuse things even further, but let's stick with Scottish Government. How, if we say there should be more money for heat, which is, you've said the 50 million isn't enough, how will that all interrelate? Will you be making recommendations that will say, well, you know, it'll be for the next budget, or will we wait until the next budget? You see the drift of where I'm going?
Absolutely see that. So firstly, on blue carbon, you are quite right to ask the question, and every time you ask me, I feel humble about I don't have the answer. So, I would like to do something on blue carbon. It's not something that the committee has offered very much advice on. We did look at it actually briefly and considered whether we would include it in a recent land use report, and felt that we didn't have enough evidence. It's something I think we'll probably have to do some specific work on. So I want to manage your expectations that we're unlikely to give lots and lots of recommendations this year. But it does sound really, it's an exciting area, and it's not something, and I'm always drawn to things where we haven't got good evidence. So I think we can do something in blue carbon. I haven't quite got a date in mind to provide you with it, but we will do it. On the broader question, it's really difficult. So I mean, in one sense, I feel very privileged not to be in government anymore, because I definitely see that as something that they will have to grapple with more than us. We are not here to offer detailed recommendations for what needs to be in every single fiscal event. But it is absolutely true to say that each time Scotland has a budget, and each time the UK sets a budget, that is an opportunity to put in place an ambitious set of spending priorities. The thing I would like to add to that is that it's not all about public spending. And in fact, the more that we look at this overall, the more that we think it's the non-spending levers that matter. So, you know, we did in the report we did last year on net zero, there was a really great report done alongside that for us. We formed an advisory group on policy, and they did some great work looking at, if you like, the non-spend or non-tax levers and their role overall. You might think of these as regulatory or standard setting measures, and it turns out that more and more we think they matter more and more. So, you know, that it matters immensely that Scotland has set a date for phasing out petrol and diesel vehicles at 2032, because, and it matters, of course, that the UK has recently upped that ambition to 2035 and possibly even earlier, because the companies that make cars see that and make provision for it. You know, so that's the kind of announcements, if I can put it that way, that you can make that fit well with the system view we've talked about and don't require lots of public spending. So even in between these big fiscal public spending events, you've got lots of opportunities to set the right laws, make the right regulations, and steer us towards net zero.
I'll just add that, you know, government sets the context within which private investment happens, whether it's by companies, financial institutions, individuals, and that context includes regulation. It includes kind of policy directions. The important thing is that there's a clear direction. The step changes, as Chris said, are really bad, because it looks, on the one hand, like there's a sudden change, and it takes time for everybody to gear up and get their heads around it. If it's a step change, you're kind of in an adverse direction. It means that confidence in the overall direction is undermined, and like I said, this next decade we have to do a hell of a lot, and so you know, private investment in all those different kind of scales is absolutely crucial, and the ability of government to set that framework within which the constraints is a big part of it, within which that investment happens, and the ambition that be kind of so that you can expect that consumer behaviour will kind of adapt to the availability of electric vehicles, for example. Electric vehicles become available because the market is demanding it. The two things kind of go together within that policy ambition of saying, well, you know, it's got to be that way. And actually, that's an international dimension in some of these markets, to some of the products that are coming along.
I kind of think there seems to be a narrative around these things of this is going to be a painful thing, but actually it's full of opportunity for individuals if they get the right signals in advance.
Absolutely. I mean, the lesson of cutting emissions so far in Scotland and right across the UK has been that it is really about the lack of pain. That's, you know, it's been a remarkable thing that's been pulled off, and we would say it's not enough. You'd expect that from the Committee on Climate Change, but it is it has been, you know, it's been hard fought, but it hasn't turned us to penury. So you know that. Why would we think it's different in the future? And you know, I'm keen to make this point as well. Once you've got to net zero, that's it. You know, it's highly unlikely you're going to turn back to using fossil fuels having achieved that. So this is the moment really to get that done, and that sets you up then to be the, you know, the modern player in the modern economy that we need to be. So the steps ahead of us are not something we should be afraid of at all. They're worth doing. They're worth doing because the science says they're worth doing, but they're also worth doing because there's a whole host of wider societal income and benefits rather that come with it.
Mark. Oh,
Sorry.
apologies.
Yeah,
Tom.
if I could add on that. We talked about kind of making sure that climate change is everyone's job across portfolios. A really crucial way, I think, of securing buy-in on that is realising that the benefits of acting on climate change translate across portfolios as well. So if you look at what's happened to diet and air quality, people with more energy-efficient homes, new skills and jobs, those are all things that other parts of government will capture the benefits of, and therefore it's in their interest to act.
Yeah, not least in public health terms as well. Mark, you'd like to come in on this?
Thinking about infrastructure. We just had the Infrastructure Commission for Scotland's report. It was quite clear on road capacity. If we're going to build more road capacity, we need to reduce it elsewhere in the system. And we need to focus much more on repairing the road capacity that we've got. Is that something you agree with? That seems to go a bit beyond the previous advice that you've recommended, which has been much more around let's decarbonise the cars, rather than looking at behavioural change and what increasing infrastructure might do. Yeah,
I think this the hidden in your question is a really important point, that you can't just look at infrastructure provision as the answer to this. So I don't mind admitting we struggle a bit with the roads question, because you know we are advocating the transition of surface transport to electric vehicles. If that's all we do alone, my point stands earlier, then this is not going to be a successful transition. We should be looking at the behaviours underneath that. The reason that surface transport emissions are going up is because we're driving more. We're not using public transport so much. We do need roads. There's no question about it. But I suppose my advice to the Scottish Government as it considers its infrastructure strategy is to look across the piece and ask the question: are we allocating the capital investment in the right places so that we bring about the right outcome? I suppose I would rather see us make even more ambitious provision for things like charging infrastructure for the cars that might go on those roads.
Yeah, I mean, you talked earlier on about like hindcasting, you know, sort of seeing the vision and then working back. What do you see then as the vision for Scotland's road infrastructure by 2030? Have we got more? Is it better? Are the potholes filled in? Are we driving more and more miles each year?
No, we're not driving more. So I can say that with some certainty.
What does it look like?
The question of which roads go where is not one that we will address directly. But we will have in a net zero world, we will have a need for the road network that we have at the moment. Whether that's expanded or contracted, I'm afraid I don't have the answer to that. It needs to be, of course, well maintained. Of course, it can make a difference. Yeah.
Right. Well, why can't you offer advice then?
Because the specific provision of how much road we require is not something that would jumps out of the numbers on what you need to do to cut emissions.
Okay, I'm just aware of the construction of the Queensferry Crossing. Political decision made. Obviously important elements there in relation to the economy, but that has resulted in 1 million extra vehicle journeys across the Forth every single year, and that's one very small piece of road infrastructure. How do you think we should be assessing the impact then? Because there's a balance for government to make about these decisions. I recognise that.
Yeah.
But if we're not transparent about how these projects may lock in emissions, it could be taking us in a radically different direction.
I think this is one of the reasons why you can't get a definitive answer from the Committee on Climate Change, and that's because it depends. Always these things, the answer to them is it depends. Now, if we have a rock-solid strategy for decarbonising the vehicles on our roads, then the question of what road provision you have naturally falls down the priority list for us when it comes to infrastructure provision overall.
I think I would just say, Chris, I think there's clearly massive interactions again, same point we were making a few minutes ago. You know, economic impacts, access to workplaces, to all sorts of other facilities. You know, supporting particular localities relative to others. So those are political judgments in the end, I think, about how you kind of balance off and, you know, one area relative to another and what kinds of investment. There are different options for how you support a particular local economy, and road transport is one of them. So I think it's very difficult for the Committee on Climate Change to get into that sort of level. However, I think you made a very important point in asking the question. It's about the transparency of the impacts on greenhouse gas emissions of the different policy options. So that absolutely has to be there, and how one option impacts in a different way from another option. So difficult judgments, but the transparency of those greenhouse gas emissions impacts has to be there in every significant government decision. I think that's the really kind of, for me, the really important point to come out of this.
We're looking right now at 3 scenarios for achieving net zero. And this will form the basis of the advice we give on the pathway. So one of those scenarios is what you might call an infrastructure-led scenario, which is very similar to what we said last year. This is where the government makes the provision for the various, in particular, infrastructure, big capital assets, things like energy networks. We're going to look at 2 others, though. One is a world where we see more rapid technology development, more rapid adoption of those technology developments. And another is where we see a more rapid or ambitious response and behavioural response from the people living in this country. We will try and use those 3 scenarios to pull out from it what looks like the key conditions of achieving net zero, in particular over the next decade. What we don't want to do is present to you an option that you can say, I'll have that one, please. So in the behaviour scenario, we will look more actively at what would be necessary for us to stop using cars, for example, in the short term. What would be the things that nudge us towards us, even harder edge things that take people out of their cars into public transport? It follows, though, that we will have to be able to substantiate and evidence that. So often the behavioural scenarios look appealing because they are cheaper. And that would be great from my perspective. The cheaper that the overall transition is, the more likely it is to succeed. But it has to be something that we can evidence. So you can expect that from us in the next year.
Talking about behaviour change in a minute, but before we do, Finn, you have a final question on the CCP.
Professor Bell mentioned how important it was that everybody works together, because obviously the UK government's objective for net zero in 2050 is reliant on the Scottish Government delivering strong policies in our devolved government, but the Scottish Government will also rely on local authorities to do their bit. So just how detailed and specific does the climate change plan that's coming up in April need to be with directing local authorities and so on? Because we always hear we've got to go further and faster. We've got 10 years to deliver 75% reduction by 2030. Ambitious, but as we keep on saying, it needs to be achievable. So just how detailed does the plan that we're going to see in April need to be in comparison to what we had in 2018?
I think that level of detail, obviously, as you say, it's implied in your question, is important. Different areas have different opportunities, of course. So densely populated areas, it looks like a better candidate for district heating. That district heating, though, is not a solution in and of itself. It enables a more efficient use of energy, but a low carbon source of energy has to be available as well. Local plans are obviously really important in terms of providing electric vehicle infrastructure. We just talked about transport and investment in roads and so on. I think it's my perspective on some of the kind of there's a lot of good intent about local energy planning because of those differences in the circumstances from which different areas are starting. Access to data, I think, and expertise to interpret and use the data is a particular challenge right now, I think, of who's responsible for developing a plan anyway, and have they got access to the right data to know that this is a good plan? There's various parties out there. The Energy Systems Catapult, for example, is offering a service to go in and help local authorities to do that kind of thing. But the particular way they're offering is incredibly intensive, lots of data required. Lots of detailed modelling, takes a long time, And then when the plan comes out, people can't understand what it means. You know, how sensitive is it to different factors? So there's still work, I think, across the sector to get the right level of support and tools to inform that. So, of course, then that plays into what is available to people, you know, the civil servants within the Scottish Government who are trying to put together the climate change plan. What do they have access to understand those different circumstances? It's better than it was, and we have to go there. And like I say, the tools and the data to back up and firm up some of the assumptions that are inevitably going to have to be made have to be put in place as well.
Okay. Rachel.
Thank you, Convener. You've touched on a number of behavioural changes, I suppose, that people will have to enact over the next decade. I was wondering if you could highlight what you think will be the most significant changes that people will face and the challenges to their daily lives, and indeed how will you engage with people to bring them over hearts and minds?
I think this is probably the most important question overall, and I don't, again, to be humble for a second on this, I don't feel we have all the answers to that. It's something that I would like us to be more and more informed on. So the question of how you engage the citizens of this country in what needs to be done to get to net zero lies right at fundamentally at the heart of whether it will be a successful transition or not. What we have seen so far is a great deal of progress in cutting emissions, but actually not a lot of that kind of engagement so far. It doesn't matter to your average citizen in this country that this year half of the electrons they'll receive through their plug are zero carbon. The kettle still boils. So what lies ahead is going to be fundamentally different to that. I would like to see us have a proper open discussion of it. There's a citizens' assembly happening here in Scotland, which I'm sure is a good way into that. The other thing that I'm very pleased to see happening is that Jim Skee is chairing the Just Transition Commission, which is looking at the big fundamental questions about what we do about the transition and employment necessary to get to net zero. Both of those will give us new evidence that we can use in the committee in our assessments. What is fundamentally true is that running all the way through this, there is an element of behaviour change. I actually don't like the term behaviour change. It implies poor behaviour. Behaviour just is. So it's just what we do. So, I'd like to see us be more creative about thinking about the ways in which we can push people towards outcomes that benefit the climate and away from those that don't. And a philosophical point on this is that this is the only big system change I'm aware of where we think the answer is to tell every actor in the system about the overall goal. So, that you wouldn't find that in, for example, health provision. If you cared about something like the productivity of the National Health Service, you wouldn't be going to every layer of the National Health Service asking them to be more productive. So, the climate's a bit like that too. So we need to break it into the meaningful things that will get us to the goal and then consider what motivations are necessary to deliver that. When we look across that, there's a whole host of things that jump out as being important. I've mentioned one already, and that's diet. Diet is important because it's also linked to health. So there's a really good thing to think about there. We don't really have good evidence on what changes people's diet. You may think that in the age of the vegetarian that we're in at the moment, that we've seen big changes in diet, but we haven't. So, the land use report that we published recently had within it a core scenario of a 20% reduction in red meat and dairy. We were hauled over the coals from some of the environmental community about that being unambitious. But if you look at the history of the last 20 years, it's been a 6% fall in those things. So that is such an important element of the overall strategy for land use that you need to think about what policies will get us to that kind of outcome overall. That requires active thought, and it's not a popular thing to discuss if you're a politician. You can find those behaviour changes in all the other sectors too. So some of these are easier than others, it's worth saying. So, you might not be filling your car up at the pump. You might instead be plugging it in. That's a behaviour change, but it's not one that I think we should be too afraid of as long as the infrastructure provision is there. Your home's still going to be warm. It just might be a heat pump that heats it rather than a gas boiler. That is a behaviour change, but it's not one that seems as difficult as shifting at national scale patterns of diet. So I suppose my other point is that we should try and pick out the things that we see as critical to the overall transition. Again, Keith made a really good point about skills provision. That's another one of those areas where I would see as a key condition of achieving net zero, a key condition of success, and focus now on those things and think about what shifts in behaviour would be necessary overall.
The linkage with skills, I think, is that then users of a service, whether it's someone installing or maintaining your heating system, or looks after your car, or who is doing the farming that produces then the products that you buy off the shelves in the supermarket, with the right skills in place, all of those sort of changes actually become quite easy. The aim is to make it as easy as possible, so that people aren't frightened by it. Any kind of change looks a bit scary at the beginning, but I think also we can underestimate our ability to adapt. In the way we can cover a large part of the society. Maybe one of the kind of tricks is being conscious of segments of society where change is actually very difficult. So, I don't know, people in kind of more vulnerable situations, or don't have as much kind of spare money to kind of adapt to different things, or wherever challenging to get to a workplace. Most of us probably can do these things if they're made easy. If the installers of the heat pump know how to do it right, and you're warm without having to think about it, that's going to be really good. If the EV charging infrastructure is there, it's easy. But people who haven't got EVs have still got to get around. So we've got to make the transport provision as easy as possible, for example, so that, again, people don't have to think about it. Smart controls in a building in terms of heating and lighting. There's no reason why the software can't be written in a good way to make it easy to use. We get used to it. Everyone's used. Lots of people, most of us are used to using mobile phones now. But then there's still a kind of a small segment of society that don't use them, and don't have access to the internet, and don't have access to all these services. So I think a key kind of societal challenge is to make sure we bring along everybody.
I think that's one of the observations. I mean, Chris, you answered the question, lots of the questions that I was going to lead on to in one, so that was a very full answer. But one of the observations I would make is that you use the term affordable, and I think it's about making sure that the whole meeting the climate change targets, that cost is spread out not only across cities but across rural areas as well. And we know that people in rural areas use fossil fuels, or they use their cars more, or perhaps they have access to beef, lamb and dairy, and like supporting their local farmers, and are very much into their provenance. And so I'm not sure if it's going to be more difficult or it's going to be more costly, but it's about sort of, because I represent a rural constituency like many of the members here, I think it's about rural proofing that and spreading that cost of decarbonisation across the whole of the UK.
I couldn't agree more. So I think I suppose the postscript to your question is that we can absolutely do this. So what we haven't had is that fundamental. We haven't stepped back and asked some of these very fundamental questions about how you achieve this fairly. I think Scotland is further ahead than the rest of the UK in considering those things, in particular because of the Just Transition Commission. But the other thing I would point to is the Treasury's work this year, which I am absolutely delighted they're doing on how you fund net zero and how crucially you do that in a fair way. That needs to reflect a whole host of these kind of fairness dimensions. And I also think that one of the things that is often lost in that discussion is this kind of rural and urban discussion. That too often we assume that everyone lives in cities, for example. That's not the case. And there is a valid and important reason for the use of fossil fuels in rural communities that are not connected to our big cities. So that necessarily means you have to think more carefully about it. I did want to put some numbers around the earlier question that you asked me. So I think one of the great things we did last year was just do that job of stepping back and asking what behaviour change needs to deliver. These are UK-wide stats, but they'll hold up in Scotland as well. And what we looked at was to get from where we are today to net zero, and what proportion of the emissions reductions that need to follow are due to technological improvements alone, and what behaviour change is necessary overall. 38%, let's call it 40% of the emissions reductions to get to net zero involve low carbon technologies or fuels, for example, alone. The rest involve some element of societal behaviour shift. Now, the more that you can promote positive climate behaviours, the cheaper this thing will be overall. So that, I think, is a really good clue that actually what comes next is going to be a challenge as much of developing and rolling out and using those new technologies as much as it is a behavioural shift. And the lesson of history is that we're less good at engineering behavioural shifts with policy than we are adopting new technologies.
I think you set some. I mean, the rural and urban, differences are very important to recognise, of course. Links back to what we were saying earlier about local policies being appropriate for the particular area. So, for example, transport we've talked about quite a bit. In cities, to a large extent, we should be encouraging people out of cars, into public transport or walking on shorter journeys. Whereas in more rural areas, EVs will have a really important part to play, and the infrastructure has to be there to support that. I think it's great if people in rural areas are really concerned about the provenance of the food that they eat. That sets a really good example that we should all follow, actually. Because although we might talk about a relatively modest shift in diet in the kind of central scenario that we've drawn up in the net zero advice and in the land use report, that has to translate through in terms of the land use here in this country, not in terms of replaced with imports where actually it might be worse. So the provenance is really important, and then it links through to modest shifts, possibly greater shifts, but still where and again we touched on this earlier, the kind of the totality of policy around land use, so that public goods more broadly, not just the production of food, can be considered and rewarded appropriately.
Right, we're going to touch on some of the specific questions that members have around the challenges in particular sectors. We have obviously been talking about all sectoral challenges throughout this morning, but move on to Finn Carson, talk about agriculture and land use.
I'm just going to contradict myself. I don't understand why we're talking so much about agriculture, given that all of agricultural activity only results in 9% of the emissions. And we talk about beef and meat production, which only attributes 3% to the output. And we've seen total emissions from agriculture and land use fall by 75% since 1990. So I can't understand why we are talking about agriculture quite so much. And I'm very concerned about emphasis on diet change, given those low figures attributed to food production. But when we see almost 1 million tonnes of food and drink wasted in Scotland each year. So I think the emphasis is in the wrong place. I think where we are with agriculture has got a lot to do with the Common Agricultural Policy. I think we have crops and agricultural production in places which are not best suited. So I think public goods for public money is very important, and land use strategy needs to be. So on that, can you tell us where you believe Scotland is with regards to public goods for public money compared to elsewhere in the UK? Because if I remember correctly, that was a real concern last year. Have we moved any further forward with addressing that issue?
No, I think still have the same concerns. So, I mean, I definitely feel that we're now having the discussion, which is a good development. But and just to say that I'm afraid I don't recognise some of those stats. I mean, I think there is an issue in agricultural emissions. They are flatlining, so they're not falling as they are in other sectors, and that is largely to do with livestock. So you're absolutely right to pull out some of the wider factors, and indeed that's the basis of the advice that we gave in their land use report, and indeed in the net zero report before that. But what needs to happen in land use is a fairly fundamental shift. We need to actually have a change in land use at the heart of the policy prescription that's here in Scotland and across the UK. I'm afraid that we do need to reduce the numbers of livestock. We don't need to do very much of that if we do it properly. What would be a disaster from my perspective is that we start importing from places that have even higher greenhouse gas emissions. So we've got good stats in the land use report that show you places like Indonesia and Brazil, for example, where there is the scope to further deforest and create new areas to graze those cattle. That has a catastrophic impact on greenhouse gas emissions. So the importance of diet is that even a 20% shift, which, as Keith said, is modest. We haven't engineered that in the last 20 years. But if we pull that off overall, that gives us enough scope then to turn over the agricultural land for natural carbon storage, especially through growing trees.
But is there not more scope, and is it something you've investigated? We're only sitting at around 75% self-sufficient in meat production in Scotland, but we're talking about diet change, which is going to be very difficult to achieve. That's not something we're going to achieve over the short term. And you've already said, even though there's growing, or apparently growing movement towards veganism and vegetarianism, which is widely reported in the media, are we not better to ensure that when people make dietary choices, they choose to buy local, to
Yes.
buy beef and lamb that's produced in Scotland? And that effect could be felt far more rapidly. So we're looking for quick changes over a far shorter time. So would we not be better putting in policies that ensure that people eat local produced produce, rather than trying to look for a dietary change, which could actually, when we look at just transition and incomes and whatever, we could find that the price of locally produced food goes up, and we see more imports come which are cheaper, which have a far higher carbon impact. So we are offshoring if we just look at it in silo.
Yes, the short answer to your question is you are right, but we still have to have a reduction in methane emissions. It's necessary for Scotland to achieve its net zero goal. Most of the meat that we eat is processed. So eating good quality meat is absolutely in line with what we're proposing here. This isn't a prescription for radical vegetarianism. This is about cutting back a little bit. And just as I've said, Scottish beef and lamb is amongst the most low greenhouse gas intensity of any meat reared anywhere in the world. So that's it follows therefore that you can eat local, but we still need to eat a little bit less of it. It's a key condition of freeing up the land for the alternative uses that I talked about. It's worth also saying though, going back to your earlier question, fundamental to our advice is an improvement in agriculture. So that's more productive agricultural practice, which is usually low carbon. And we're also talking about a set of other things underneath that will be necessary. Most obviously, turning over that land to the alternative uses. We don't have a policy prescription that will achieve that in Scotland, nor do we have, as principled a basis for doing it as DEFRA at UK level has introduced this idea of public money for public goods, which is not something that I understand Fergus Ewing is keen on. Now, we can shoehorn in the environmental objectives to the existing system of agricultural payments that we have in Scotland, but it's hard. So, the sooner we understand how that's going to be done, the better.
I'll just add to that, again, to re-emphasise, net zero in 2050 means every sector has to make big shifts. So, although agriculture might look small as a proportion now, by the time we get to 2050, it looks like a very large proportion. Yeah. And I don't think it's a question of either or in terms of the policy options you've set out. It's both and. The provenance question again. Local, buy local. Yes, absolutely. And relatively modest shifts in diet. It's not radical stuff. Years ago, I moved into a house when I was just finished being a student where it was all vegetarians. That was the rule. It's a bit of a shock to me. There's not much of me to start with. I had to pull my belt in 2 notches within 6 months. So I would not advocate that kind of thing. But still a shift is good for us. Yeah.
When we look at the budget, we've heard that there's, and we welcome the Agricultural Transformation Fund of 40 million. We've also had the big announcement that the Cabinet Secretary was very excited about with peatland restoration. And we've had some planting targets. I'll ask you 3 questions. Do you think the 40 million is enough to see that transition in agriculture? Are we ambitious enough with our peatland restoration? And in your report, it was suggested that we needed between 15 and 24,000 hectares of new trees, but the Scottish Government are only looking to plant 12,000. Are they sufficient planting targets, sufficient investment in agriculture and in peatland to achieve 75% reduction in 10 years' time?
I might in a second get Tom to run through the stats on some of this, but the Agricultural Transformation Fund was I think a good development. I think that's one of that's a clue that things are moving on this. As positive a step as that is, it's not the kind of systemic and systematic shift that we will need. So it's a good start, but we need more. And you would expect us to say that, but it is particularly important because if you don't have the shift in land use underneath this, then net zero it will quickly be out of sight. And it takes time to grow a tree. So this is pretty important stuff. That if we don't get right in the next 5 to 10 years, then it will be out of sight. We will not be in the position where we can use our land in the right ways to get to net zero overall. You asked about the kind of key priorities, if you like. So tree planting was one, upland peat was another, bioenergy crops was another. Tom, do you want to run through the numbers since we have them?
Yeah. So on the peatland, the amount of money that's been announced and the kind of long-term framing of that, I think we would really welcome as an organisation. As a minimum, Scotland needs to be doing about 18,000 hectares of restoration per year. If that funding can deliver that restoration, then that's excellent. If it can deliver even more, then that's even better. To an extent, the more peat that you can restore, the better. So it's very scalable in that sense. And it has very, very large co-benefits for other things like water quality. On tree planting specifically, we have a kind of modelled set of scenarios that looks at Scotland doing new tree planting of, as you said, between 15 and 24,000 hectares of new trees every year between now and 2045. The 12,000 that you mentioned is, I think, within the next calendar year, and we've kind of, within our scenarios, we've allowed for some kind of steady ramp up to that level. We know that that kind of market for afforestation isn't just going to happen overnight. And I think that 12,000 figure is a very good first step on the way to increased afforestation. That 15 to 15,000 hectares should be considered the bare minimum. And again, it's scalable in the sense that the more of it you do, the more carbon is sequestered now, and is sequestered in every year between now and 2045. On the £40 million figure, again, as Chris said, I think very welcome to see that money has been diverted towards decarbonising agriculture. But at a UK level, we've estimated the cost of delivering the land transformation at around about £1.4 billion a year. So comparing the scale of the money that you talked about in terms of peatland and trees and agriculture, that looks like 100 or 200 million pounds a year. Purely thinking about orders of magnitude, that will not be enough long term.
Mark?
Thanks, Convener. I wanted just to shift us back into looking at decarbonisation of buildings and heat. I'm really concerned about this because I got a letter through the post the other day encouraging me to connect to the gas grid, and it was from the Energy Savings Trust. I mean, the fact that I've already got a renewable biomass system from locally supplied wood was somewhat ironic there, but it does pose a question about where are we going, and are we going to that destination quickly enough on heat? Because you laid out earlier on, there's two options here. One is we get green, or as you say, blue hydrogen in the gas grid, or we're going down a path of further electrification, air to water source heat pumps, and that type of technology. And there's a huge amount to be done around skills and everything else to get us to that point. Are we almost beyond the point of no return now in terms of making a decision that's really going to make an impact within the next 9 years?
I think when it comes to replacing heating systems, because things reach their end of life, to kind of break down, that's where we've got to make it easy for people to make a low carbon heating decision. So it means building up those skills and access now, at least, and the information. So it might not be a massive skills base, but you know where to look and who to go and talk to, and it will be kind of specified in the right way. I think you're right, it is a kind of an irony that some of the advice might be in terms of just, I guess, simply based now on lowest cost. Now, a gas-based system would appear better. I mean, we have to tackle these questions back to the just transition thing, I suppose. There's an element of it, of questions of fuel poverty and what are the affordable systems. I know that the regulator for the gas and electricity markets, Ofgem, has a big concern about affordability in the short term. That has to be shifted, I think, towards affordability in the medium to long term, and then where the balance of costs fall in terms of different aspects of the infrastructure, for example, you know, how it's all paid for. So, yeah, I think that's just in summary. Yeah, we have to make the low carbon choices easy.
Yeah, but in terms of hydrogen, I mean, a lot has to happen if we're to crack hydrogen off of methane and capture the carbon. A huge amount has to happen.
Absolutely.
In the North Sea oil and gas sector, within other industries that use the byproducts, such as Moss Moran, you know, potentially carbon capture and storage there. I visited the plant a few weeks ago. No plans whatsoever. Don't see any form of carbon capture technology that could be retrofitted to Scotland's second biggest polluter. So it's a huge amount of system change.
So you're
Are
absolutely
we
right.
anywhere near being able to implement that stuff within the
So
next
you,
10 years?
but you asked the question earlier, is it too late? No, absolutely not, it's too late. I mean, it's not too late. So there is a period over the next 25 to 30 years that we need to pull this off. Now that, however, means that decisions need to be taken in the next 5 to 10 years about how we think it's best to get there. I'll make my point again. The biggest single challenge that faces Scotland and the UK is what to do about heat. And the point at which we could put off that decision has ended. So we're going to have to see solid plans for how we get from here to there. That doesn't mean they need to be implemented today, because some of this is going to be difficult and it involves big decisions about infrastructure and how that's paid for. But we haven't got that clarity at the moment. Now, we could start very quickly on this heat transition, and indeed the Scottish Government has some good plans in place to do that, but that's really at the margins. The big questions are what we do about those properties that are on the gas network. And there are big decisions about what the right choice is for those properties. Some of that is, there is still a degree of uncertainty about what the right path should be, and I fully accept that. But unless there are active steps to resolve the uncertainty, then it starts to make me worry that we're not really on a credible path.
A lot of the active steps are about ensuring that the options are still available.
Yeah.
So we have the option for carbon capture and storage, which means making sure we're confident in the technology and that the facilities are investable. Doing the work now to establish that, making sure that hydrogen, there is a market for hydrogen. We can start to kind of seed that now by potentially, just one idea, something analogous to the renewables obligation for electricity a few years ago, where there's an obligation on a certain percentage of the supply through the existing gas network to come from hydrogen, and then there's an obligation there to make sure that is from at least a blue source. So you start to get that, but that's dependent now. I think on the critical path now for that is the safety and billing standards. So how quickly are we going to resolve those things and get the standards in place so that then you can put a policy in place to develop a market and so on and so forth. So these are steps which keep the options alive and start to resolve some of the uncertainties that Chris is talking about.
Rule of thumb, sorry Tom, go ahead.
So we talk about low regret options a lot in the kind of heating world. Your specific example of a home off the gas grid that I assume the Energy Saving Trust thought was an oil boiler, for example. Moving from that oil boiler to connect into the gas grid to potentially then having to disconnect from the gas grid in 20 years' time would not be considered a low regret option. There is already a technology solution for that property, which is a heat pump, and will save the user of an oil boiler money now and for the next 30 years. So in that specific example, I think you're right to query it.
And my rule of thumb is going to be that the next 10 years are where the uncertainties need to be resolved and clear plans are made, and then from 2030 onwards we need to be full tilt deployment, because this is a huge challenge. Across the UK you've got something approaching 30 million buildings, most of which, the vast majority of which are not are using fossil fuels. So you know that there is a period over which we do have time, so we can make these plans and we can resolve these uncertainties, but there comes a point when the government, and it has to be the government, sets out its vision for how it will be achieved and the policies that will drive the infrastructure change that's necessary. That's partly why I make the point whenever I'm asked that this is the hardest of the challenges that lies before us, because it's not like the electric vehicle transition. We're not going to get to the point where straightforward economics will make you want to purchase an electric car over a petrol car. So this is something that we need a well unified and integrated approach from industry, the consumer and government on.
Claudia.
Thank you, Convener. Just moving quite seamlessly into a bit more detail about industry. In the short time we've still got other questions members want to ask as well. But you'll know that we've got the Circular Economy Bill coming up in the Scottish Parliament in the imminent future. And there are all sorts of opportunities within that for remanufacturing and other areas. And I'm wondering if that's something that you're looking at within the committee, and also if there are any other brief comments you had to make about industry over and above what you've stressed about the opportunities and the signalling and to finance.
So circular economy is something that personally I'm extremely interested in. I think I'm worth saying we struggle a bit with it in the committee because we are driven by the carbon targets. So it's something we should be better at. And I think that's also true of waste. So waste is a sector in inverted commas that sort of falls between the cracks a little. The strategy on waste is clearer, but I think we are. You could legitimately accuse us of being overly blunt in the way that we view the waste challenge. It's about there's a lot more happening there than simply removing waste from landfill, which is the circular economy is probably the way into that. So that's another area where I would like to be better at offering more complicated and adult advice. So we haven't been able to do that as much as I would like to. That's something that will follow. On industry more generally. This has probably been the area that we have developed our understanding of most in the last 18 months or so. And that has been achieved by, overall a change in the methodology that we take to industrial emissions. So we used to say that unless we can be absolutely clear that an industrial process can be decarbonised, we can't put it in the models. Now we say, well, if we know it can work elsewhere, why wouldn't it work in industry? So that has opened up a whole host of opportunities to cut industrial emissions, and in particular to do things like fuel switching, which is a term that we use a lot. That's where we substitute where we presently use a fossil fuel for something that's zero carbon, like hydrogen, for example. More and more, we are looking at a world where there are industrial clusters of activity, and at least 2 or 3 of them need to be in Scotland, if not more. These are places where fuel switching becomes easier because you've got a ready supply of something like hydrogen, if you've got it ready to go. It's also a place where you can do carbon capture and storage, but again, Mr. Ruskell's point is correct. You've got to have the infrastructure in place, and that's not going to happen by magic. I would quite like us to see, I'm speaking beyond anything we've published so far, but I'd like us to see we should be viewing this as an industrially led thing. And I think if you do that, again, if you look across the UK, I think it is important to look across the UK. There's probably, you could see 5 or 6, possibly 7 areas where it's very sensible to make one of these industrial clusters and to continue to have industry in those places, but decarbonised industry. It would be hugely problematic if Scotland weren't one of the places that had, where it wasn't a part of the UK that had a significant bit of industry because of the natural advantages we have in developing them here. We're not far from Grangemouth here. That's a good place to put a decarbonised industrial cluster. You could have something in Aberdeen as well, potentially. If we start from industry and work back, which is not something we've typically done, instead of viewing it as a problem to be managed, but as it should be an opportunity, and when you view it in those terms, then you can build in a much more positive story about the jobs that go with it. And my experience of politicians is they're much more drawn to those things when you can present them as opportunities. So we've got to get over ourselves in industry and stop thinking about it as a problem and start viewing it as something that actually is an opportunity for Scotland. And it's true to say that there are big and important UK reserve fiscal powers in this space, but there's huge opportunity for the Scottish Government to make good provision for industrial clusters that are decarbonised too in Scotland. And the more that they do that, the more it will look advantageous for the UK as a whole to have its industrial clusters here in Scotland. Do you agree?
Yes.
We are running out of time. However, Finlay is going to ask a very quick question, and then I'm going to have the final question. There's a number of things that we still want to ask you, so we're going to write to you, if that's okay. Finlay.
I'm absolutely delighted because you gave me a real in there about the decarbonised industrial can we think out the box? Or what's your thoughts about thinking out the box? Dumfries and Galloway has a huge potential when it comes to wind, and understand to get to net zero, we're looking about 80% of electric production is going to be from solar or wind, or that's prediction. But to actually achieve that, we need to multiply by 10 our electrical storage potential, and from 3 gigawatts up to about 30. We've got fantastic potential with wind, but also with hydro. So what thoughts have you got about industrial clusters round areas where there's fantastic potential for hydro and wind, and potentially battery storage of electricity?
Yeah, all great things, absolutely. And there's no question they bring massive advantages. As you said, the renewable energy capacity, generation capacity, has to grow to meet the growing electrical demand, as well as the proportion of it that comes from low carbon sources. Storage of different forms is going to be really important to managing that electricity system, because the variability of demand. Storage can take different forms, of course. It's not just batteries, although batteries, as the cost comes down and continues to come down, will be enormously valuable to that. Heat storage within a building. Hot water tanks are very cheap, provided you've got the space to put them in, and they become really important in terms of kind of a buffering when you've got things like a heat pump. Hydro resources, if you've got the reservoirs, the dams, extremely important, very, very useful. I'm not sure how much it would cost, or how much potential, the low-hanging fruit, how much of there is there, and you're going to climb a bit further up the tree to get it. But of course, it brings benefits. I think there are questions about how those things are financed, especially the large-scale developments, pumped hydro storage, for example. Very capitally intensive. Of course, we know they bring benefits over the longer term in terms of how you manage the system. The facilities we've got were developed under state-owned days. They were, financed by the taxpayer. There's strong analogies with the way interconnectors are developed. I think, in terms of the way they can move energy in time rather than interconnectors move it in space, if you like. We do have particular regulatory arrangements to help the financing of interconnectors, which will be a important part of the mix, by the way. A kind of cap and floor mechanism. So it limits the risk to the investor, but it's a sharing of risk, let's say. I think there is potential for similar mechanisms to be used in respect of developing large-scale storage, such as pumped hydro.
I want to round things off. We've talked throughout today about the shared responsibility between two governments. And there is a responsibility also as well in the two parliaments as well, in looking at the strategies that each government put in place or not. I'd like your views on how we can improve that collaboration and how necessary that is. I mean, we're looking, and Finlay's mentioned that UK targets, reaching them is reliant on Scotland meeting theirs, and the same is true the other way around as well. But the most important thing is that we get this done for society. So it's incumbent on those governments to be working together and the parliaments to be scrutinising the action that they do take. How do you think that's best achieved? What would you say to both governments and both parliaments as we look upon the challenge that we've got responsibility for?
So I'm going to make a technical point. I think both governments are crap at this. So I think this is something we're going to have to be better at all round. It should not be the case that only the Committee on Climate Change takes an integrated view of the challenges across the UK, and yet it is. So there is no basis for the Scottish Government to raise legitimate concerns with the UK Government about what's happening at Westminster level and some of the things that will matter to the achievement of the Scottish targets, and vice versa. So we're hosting the World's Climate Summit in Glasgow this year. And I'll tell you now that the climate doesn't give a monkeys about these constitutional and institutional boundaries. So we have to be better at discussing this, and we have to have a place to, I don't know whether that is a clearinghouse or a discussion, a point where there is a real discussion about what needs to be done to the strategy overall. And it's that doesn't happen. So there are various mechanisms in constitutional terms that allow the Scottish Government to have a discussion with the Westminster Government. But it's not a place where you discuss long-term strategies for decarbonising the economy. And there aren't, I'm afraid, the strong links between the departments in Whitehall and the Scottish Government that used to be there 10 years ago. That needs to be reconstituted. You can pull out some of the key sectoral challenges, and there should be those are the areas where there needs to be much stronger links with Whitehall, between Scottish Government and Whitehall. And my own experience in the Scottish Government is that immediately leaving the Scottish Government to go into the CCC, I enjoyed a much better relationship with all the departments in Whitehall than I used to have when I was Director of Energy and Climate Change in the Scottish Government. That shouldn't be like that. We're an independent body that's not part of government. So, that needs fundamental attention. And again, we have to get past it, because it will shortly become a real barrier. So I would like to see that improve, and I'm not handing out blame to any one party here. There has to be, though, a place to have a discussion about these governance issues. Because just as you say, there's a quid pro quo here. There are some elements of the Scottish strategy that we'll need to deliver for the UK as a whole, and there are very definitely some elements of the UK strategy that will need to be in place to make Scotland meet its targets. And at the moment, I don't really see a place for a sensible discussion about any of that. I think that the last point I'll make on this is that, standing back from it, there are a set of governance challenges writ large for the whole of government. So we talked about some of them in this evidence session. Every layer of government has a role in the net zero transition. Westminster, Scottish Government, but also local authorities. And even beneath that, you can look at, even hyper-local policies that will really matter. How you coordinate and make good decisions across all of that is not a topic that really any bit of government has applied itself to. I'm really pleased to hear that the Institute for Government in Westminster is looking at governance of climate change. I hope that's a long-running programme. Something we in the Committee on Climate Change are very keen to do is to put some evidence around what works at local level. And we'll try and do that in the 6th Carbon Budget Advice in September. That's something that we'll continue after that, so that we can start to present some better guidance to every layer of government about what works. But I'll just make this point again. We need to very, very rapidly have a proper place where we can set aside these political disagreements, which are all valid, of course, but get into the nitty-gritty about how you're actually going to deliver a strategy over the next 3 decades that gets the UK as a whole to net zero and gets Scotland to net zero by 2045. And the time's running out for that.
Okay, I think that's a good point to end on. I want to thank you very much for your time this morning. I'm going to suspend this meeting briefly. A third item today is to hear from Scottish Water on its investment plan, and I welcome our representatives from Scottish Water to the committee today. We have Dame Susan Rice, the Chair, Douglas Milliken, the Chief Executive, and Professor Simon Parsons, the Director of Strategic Customer Service Planning. A bit of a mouthful I got there. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. I'd like to just open things up by asking about your timeline for delivery. You've got a 25-year strategy and how that fits into Scottish Government budgeting, priority setting, price determinations and policy.
Thank you for that. So, if I can just place this in a little bit of context. So we, for a long time now, have operated in multi-year regulatory periods where the Scottish Government initiate the process by requesting the Water Industry Commission to conduct a strategic review of charges. And they did that a couple of years ago and then produced some updated guidance last year. And although the ask is for investment plans and price setting for the next 6 years from 21 to 27, behind that was a request that we actually set that in a longer term context. And that actually as an industry, us together with the regulators, looked at developing a long-term vision for the water sector. And that vision that we came up with and that was launched in October last year sets the context for our strategic plan. So our strategic plan is all rooted in achieving this long-term vision that ministers have asked us to achieve. And coming back to the nearer term, the government have set out in a consultation on their objectives for the next 6 years and the principles of charging exactly the sort of financial framework that they would want to apply for us. So our plan is absolutely rooted in the requests that government have made for us, which in turn will be joined up with other aspects of wider government planning.
I'm going to move on to questions from Claudia Beamish to ask about some of the goals in the plan.
Thank you, Kavina, and good morning to you all. Could I ask how alignment to the Sustainable Development Goals has influenced the strategic plan and how this will influence delivery?
So the water sector vision that I was referring to a moment ago is completely aligned to the Sustainable Development Goals, most obviously to SDG 6 in terms of access for water and sanitation for all. But actually when we did the mapping, we reckon that actually we contribute directly or indirectly to 10 of the 17 SDGs. So the vision is absolutely aligned to that and indeed to the National Performance Framework. Our strategic plan is then aligned to making sure that it's taking us on the right path to achieving the water sector vision. And then what we will be setting out to do over the course of this year is setting out a delivery plan which will set out the key actions and milestones that we'll take over the next 6 to 10 years in delivery of the first part of that strategic plan.
Thank you. I was also going to ask you about NPF 4, but could you say how you're going to work out alongside the forum that we heard from in the last session with Scottish Water, how the National Performance Framework plans will be sort of. I'll rephrase that. Have you had discussions with the forum in terms of customers about how that will go forward? Because it's a very inclusive sort of structure, the National Planning Framework.
Okay, so we've had extensive discussions with the customer forum over the last couple of years, and their role and the challenge to us has been highly influential in the form and the content of the strategic plan that we published in the beginning of February. And indeed, just ahead of that, they agreed that that plan reflected fairly the priorities of customers and citizens across the country. I think looking forward into NPF4 or indeed any other form of guidance or instruction that comes out in the years ahead, our plan will be flexible to be able to accommodate whatever new expectations are placed upon us. So I think specifically in terms of NPF4, there's a lot in our plan, for example, about trying to encourage blue-green infrastructure. And there's a lot we do in partnership with authorities across Scotland in that regard at the moment, and making sure that when areas are prioritised for development, that land is set aside to make sure there's sustainable management of drainage. Clearly, we'll be engaging over time in encouraging the use of water efficient systems in new house building and renovations, and promoting other aspects of sustainable drainage. Indeed, our own surface water policy is very much aligned with that, to minimise the risk of flooding from sewers for customers and pollution of the environment.
Right, that's helpful. And could you say, going back a step, in terms of informing your strategy, has the climate change plan, which we've had a particular interest in informed your strategy, and will you be feeding into the updated plan, which will be laid in April?
So let me cover that just at a very high level, and I'll let Simon pick up some of the particulars. I think really at the heart of our strategic plan are the two critical dimensions around climate change, both adaptation and mitigation. So at a high level, we are very closely aligned, but let Simon say a little more.
Yeah, thank you and good morning. So firstly, obviously, in the climate change plan, within our strategic plan, we call out the need to adapt for climate change and our activities around adaptation for climate change, and also fairly strongly in terms around mitigating our impacts on climate change. And one of our three outcomes in the strategic plan is actually going beyond net zero by 2040, so 5 years ahead of the Scottish Government's commitments. So alongside that, we'll now be
A bit of detail about how your strategy is developing in those terms, in terms of net zero by 2040.
Yeah, so what we, in the strategic plan, we set out that we produced during this year a roadmap for us getting to net zero emissions by 2040. And that's both our operational activities, which we've made year-on-year improvements on, but also in our kind of capital activities, you know, in terms of directly associated with our investment programme. So we'll be setting out this year actually our roadmap of how we'll get there, and that's drawing on external expertise, our own expertise within Scottish Water as well. And that'll cover our use of renewable energy, for example, the work we'll do in terms of looking at alternate materials in our capital programme, alternative techniques, for example. So a whole range of different activities. Because at a high level, our emissions today, if you look at both our operational and our capital programme, is around 500,000 tonnes a year. So some significant work for us to reduce that down.
And will you be able to feed into the updated climate change plan?
Yeah, so we're quite aligned in terms of the work that we're doing in there, and there'll be activities that we can obviously enable around blue-green infrastructure, for example, around access to our land, and there's a big probably theme for us in there around peatland restoration in particular, in terms of, you know, multiple benefits to us in terms of obviously for climate change, but also it kind of makes sure we can secure high quality source waters for our treatment works.
Thank you.
Mark, you wanted to come in there.
The net zero target is obviously the national goal for Scotland. There'll be some sectors that will struggle, I guess, to meet that and will make a smaller contribution. Perhaps there'll be other sectors that will go way beyond that and will be able to hit net zero perhaps earlier and maybe even become carbon positive in the terms of production of renewable energy or, you know, peatland restoration or whatever. I'm just wondering where you think you sit, because your target is the national target, net zero. Well, that's great, but then you look at your land holdings, look at the catchments that drain into your water. You know, not denying the fact you've got a lot of challenges in terms of your electricity production, but you've got a lot of assets as well. And it's a sense of you're a highly innovative public sector company. That's great to see. Great to see utility in that space. But, you know, how quickly could you go if the economic regulator said, yeah, you can put more customer money into this because it's an absolute existential crisis for customers as well?
We are being hugely ambitious in this area, and I guess the mindset we're trying to create amongst our people, and indeed all our delivery partners, is actually what is the art of the possible on an end-to-end basis. And I believe and I hope that ultimately we can get into that overall positive position. There probably will maybe some elements of our emissions that will be very, very difficult to completely eliminate, but there'll be other areas where absolutely we can make a really positive contribution. But it's very complex because it goes right the way from where raw materials are extracted for the manufacture of steel, for example, or the manufacture of pipes, right the way through to the processing of those raw materials into finished goods, transportation, as well as what we use here in Scotland. So we're trying to take a really holistic and global perspective on this, which is what is the emissions footprint associated with any of our activities, and let's do all we possibly can on any individual element to get to as close to zero as possible, and on all the areas where we can be really positive, doing that too.
Mm-hmm. So you could meet it quicker than 2040 then?
I don't want to overcommit here. I mean, I think we've made the commitment to government that by late summer we will publish our route map. What I will say is we're being highly ambitious, and the sort of challenge that you've just given me is a challenge I'm sharing with our people internally.
There's other challenges that you're going to have to factor in, or you will have factored into your strategic plan, and that's around the EU exit. I mean, can you give us an overview of how you've factored that in? You know, there's a lot of things around environmental standards there. There's payment regimes. You know, how have you factored in the? Effectively, we don't know what's happening. How have you managed to factor the fact that we don't know and think there might be a change in landscape into your strategic plan?
I mean, I think. I mean, at one level, it's impossible to do. But actually, the whole thrust of our strategic plan is to look at fundamentally, there are, I think, four main challenges ahead for us. One of which is making sure that we keep delivering really excellent services for our customers, and particularly in the context of having to adapt to the changing climate, as well as replacing our ageing infrastructure. There's then our commitment to net zero, but through it all, we've got to make sure that we keep the support and trust of our customers, who will over time need to pay more for their services. So that's at the heart of the challenge we face. Now, clearly, between now and 2040, 2045, there are lots of uncertainties. There are lots of things that come along that we can't envisage. In the same way, we don't know exactly what the post-Brexit implications will be. So our plan is effectively to guide us on a direction of travel, but we will need to have lots of flexibility to adapt, whether that's to adapt to challenges or indeed to take advantage of opportunities that come along in the years ahead. But I think if I look specifically towards kind of EU environmental regulations, etc., we're assuming, based on the statements government have made, that they're very much committed to preserving the current standards. Clearly, over time, as is perhaps new insight and new research, either into environmental dimensions or drinking water dimensions, those standards may change, and we will need to address whatever changes in standards may come down the track.
Okay, thank you. Finlay.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm going to look at charging and investment. Last week, the Water Industry Commission Scotland published its strategic review of charges. Can I ask you for your initial reaction to that report?
Yeah, I think the Water Industry Commission have taken a very courageous position, because they haven't just done what utility regulators typically do, which is just look at what are the needs for the next 5-year period. They've actually said that they've got a duty to look at the interests both of current customers and future customers. And therefore, it's right to look at what will the requirements be over a kind of 20-25-year horizon. And looking at what the implications of that, for example, will be in terms of the future scope for efficiency in Scottish Water, what that will mean in terms of investment demands, and therefore what it ultimately will mean in terms of customer charges. And I don't think it's an easy place for an economic regulator to come out and say, well, actually, looking at all the facts as we see them, that the consequences for customers will be slight upward increases in their prices. But what is interesting is, from all the research that we did with customers in producing our plan, they want us to be really honest with them around what the financial consequence will be, and very clear from our customers that they don't want us to put off price increases if they're necessary to replace their assets and protect the environment. So against that backdrop, I think what the Water Industry Commission have come out with is going to be challenging for us to deliver, but is very much acting in the interest both of the future customers as well as today's customers.
Okay, so do you believe that your model of planning and investment will be able to deliver on preventative spend models which will give you long-term security to meet those outcomes?
I think it should. It's certainly an improvement of what we've had so far. And what we've had is worked really well, where we set investment priorities for a 5 or 6 year period. That's allowed us a lot of clarity in planning. But I think this new model we're going into, which will enable us to take account of emerging priorities and continually reprioritise what are the most important things to focus on, not just be driven by 5 or 6 year periods. I think that will be good, and that will be an enabler of more effective and efficient delivery too.
Okay. The shared vision, which was published in 2019, suggested that together we will support health and well-being of a nation, we will promote access to natural environment, encourage communities to enjoy it. Does your budget allocation and spending plans reflect that shared commitment across other portfolios, so health, and, the environment, transport, energy? Is that a shared vision, and is your budget allocation reflecting that?
So I think if I can take that in terms of the short term and the long term. I think in terms of the short term, what the Water Industry Commission have suggested is that the sort of theoretical range for price change would be between 1% and 2% above inflation. But saying actually to be prudent, it should probably be between 1.5% and 2% above in inflation per year. Then on top of that, the government are increasing the amount of borrowing they're going to make available in this next period to over £1 billion. So that together should enable about 10% more investment in this next period than we've delivered in the current period. And I think that that is absolutely in line with the sort of investment that will be sensible for us to make in the next period. However, when we look out towards the middle of the century, we call out very clearly in our strategic plan that there are lots of unknowns. We can make a pretty good handle on what might it cost to replace our ageing infrastructure. But I can't sit here today and say exactly that I know what it will cost us to adapt to the impacts of our changing climate. But there's impact right across our systems. We can make an estimate of it, but clearly there will be new factors that get revealed. And equally, the cost of getting to net zero, we're on a journey to try and work that out. Again, there'll be uncertainties there. So what we've said clearly in our plan, that over time, as the costs of delivering the plan become clearer, then we're committed to engaging with yourselves and with our customers so that the long-term financial consequences are clear and they can then be taken into account at future strategic reviews, for example, the one that will happen ahead of 2027.
You've got very ambitious and significant plans to replace old infrastructure, whatever. Do you have any contingency budget, financial or otherwise, which will support businesses and communities which will be, even just in the short term, adversely affected by the works that you'll carry out? Because we've mentioned this before in previous sessions that, you know, I believe Scottish Water have got a duty of care and to be a good community partner when it comes to upgrading infrastructure and impact on communities. So have you factored in any sort of contingency to ensure that communities, even in the short term, are not disadvantaged?
So we've made a very significant commitment in our plan all about trying to empower customers and communities in everything that we do. And one aspect of that will be to ever more involve communities in not just how we deliver investment, but what investment is delivered and indeed when it's delivered. So we recognise that often when we go in to do investment, it does create inconvenience. And we're absolutely committed to trying to minimise any negative impact and wherever possible, find positive impacts for communities. And if indeed coming out of, let's say, appraising a particular project in a particular community, that there's a definite ask of the community that we should take account of, and there are modest financial consequences, then we would take account of that in assessing that investment project.
Okay, and finally, can I have your thoughts on the Water Industries Commission's suggestion that you should optimise management of PFI contracts? Can you give us an idea of how that might work in practice?
Yeah, so we've got 9 PFI projects that we inherited when we set up, covering 20 wastewater treatment plants and a large sludge treatment centre. So one example would be that one of those contracts actually we bought back last year. The contract came onto the market and we took advantage of that and we brought that back in-house. So that'd be a really good example of how we optimise it. So again, if we've got other situations where we've got a willing seller, then we may well take advantage of that to buy them back. Equally, there could be examples of contracts where we choose to engage in possibly extending the life of them. And a good example of that would be the contract that we've got for sludge treatment and disposal at Daldowie in Glasgow. That contract is due to expire in 2026, and we're actively exploring with the PFI company there whether it would be in their interest and ours to extend it, both in terms of whether that's a good thing to do commercially, but also then in the timing of that, of trying to choreograph the timing of that with when other PFI projects expire around 2030.
Okay, thank you.
Rachel, you have some questions around flooding and flood
thank you.
management.
Morning. I just wondered if you could set out how the strategic plan and the delivery plan, together with the MP F4, will clarify the responsibility of flood planning, and also perhaps if you can highlight the benefits that that will bring.
Okay. So if I look at flooding at the moment, so there are multiple organisations with roles within flooding, ourselves in terms of dealing with flooding from the sewerage network, obviously SEPA in their roles, and local authorities and the Scottish Government as well. And I think the recent Infrastructure Commission report called out, for example, the need for a bit more clarity in and around the roles and responsibilities in and around flooding. I think there's some really good examples of where this can work very, very well. So we in partnership with local authorities and SEPA and Scottish Government, run 2 drainage partnerships, one in Glasgow and one here in Edinburgh, and the Lothians Drainage Partnership. And that's a really good example about where we can get true alignment and actually organisations working very closely together to deal with surface water and also the multiple causes of flooding. So there are some really good examples about where there already work on there. I think the National Planning Framework really calls out proactive management of surface water, and we'll see lots of new developments which are talking more and more about blue-green infrastructure and surface water management. So we're seeing lots of very positive action in this way. But I'm sure that there's more we can do, and we would hope that the drainage partnerships that we run are really good examples, exemplars of where we can get alignment between ourselves and other organisations to really help solve the problems of flooding for communities.
Do you have any examples of where you have made improvements to the SUDS network, and how you see the current efficiency and efficacy of that network?
Yeah, I'll give an example first of all, and it's one I mentioned last time we were in here a while ago, and it's actually what's called the Smart Canal System in Glasgow. And this is a fantastic example of collaborative working between ourselves, Scottish Canal, Glasgow City Council, and other organisations in the Glasgow Drainage Partnership. And here's a real example about where clever management of the surface water means that we can open up areas of North Glasgow for development. And that's all based on SUDS infrastructure in terms of the infrastructure we put in place there. And that's a very good example of how kind of collaborative working and focus on surface water really manages. Now, SUDS, as we know, the implementation of SUDS has been around Scotland for a number of years, and there are kind of historical issues with the maintenance and the design of those SUDS systems, and we're in the process of vesting significant numbers of those SUDS systems in on that one. New developments, much clearer guidance, much clearer information for them in terms of the design and maintenance of those SUDS systems, which would make them easier for us to vest and also easier for in terms of their operation and their maintenance. So SUDS, I think there's been, history has been legacy of poor design and implementation, much clearer guidance, and that can continue. I'm sure there's much more we can still do in terms of clearer guidance, clearer shared guidance across Scotland and the UK in terms of the design of them. But they just say they're a really important part in our future infrastructure.
I just want to push you a bit on that. Obviously, climate change threat for flooding and for more surface water is very imminent. And I wondered how you were mitigating against impacts to the environment and indeed the costs of surface water to businesses,
Yes.
for example.
So we last year we launched our surface water strategy, and it calls out two things. First of all, no more surface water going into our networks. So how do we work with businesses, for example, new developments, to make sure that no new surface water enters our sewerage network? And that's really about not putting additional pressure on our existing assets, because there's no doubt the future forecast for climate change, surface water and rainfall will put more and more pressure on our existing assets. So we've got two phases. One is to no more in, and also find opportunities for taking what surface water is going into our networks out of them. So no more in, what's in out is our focus.
And are there different mitigation practices that you use to control that surface water in urban areas and rural areas? Are they different or are they the same?
I mean, the pressures tend to be more in urban environments, where there's obviously kind of hard standing, in terms of actually the green space has been reduced. Anything green is pretty good at slowing down the amount of surface water going in. So the challenges we tend to see are in urban environments, in terms of your Glasgow, your Edinburgh, Aberdeen, Dundee, these types of environments where hard standing, roof area, for example, means that much more surface water is captured and transferred very quickly into the sewer network.
Just got one small point, if I got time. So just to push you on my question with regards to the pressure, financial pressure on business of extra surface water, what is in place to, I suppose, help businesses with those increasing costs, particularly related to climate change?
So I think the reality, if you look at our cost base, is over half our costs are to do with the wastewater side of activities relative to the water side. And within that, the handling of surface water is a massive part of the costs involved. Because if you just even imagine that the size of sewers that are constructed are actually designed really to cope with all the surface water that goes in, foul sewage in volumetric terms is a much smaller part. Even if you look typically at the design of wastewater treatment plants, they're designed to cope with volumes of water up to 3 times the amount of foul sewage. So the transportation and treatment of surface water through the sewage system is inherently expensive. Now, coming to the specific issue of businesses, the way the policy works at the moment, and it's the government to set the charging policy framework, is that if a business does not discharge any surface water into the sewer system, then they don't pay any surface water charges. But clearly, if they do discharge surface water in, then they do have to pay surface water charges. And I think one of the issues that we are under ongoing exploration with government around is, should there be changes to those charging arrangements that might incentivise the removal of surface water from the sewers. And I think it is an area we will keep looking at with government, but recognising that clearly if that is successful, there is still a very substantial cost burden associated with all the surface water infrastructure that needs to be borne by the rest of the customer base. So it is an area that we are continuing to explore, but it's not one in which there are necessarily easy answers.
Finn, you had a question on this issue.
I would certainly say there's a grey area over grey water in towns and whatever. Do we need clearer lines of responsibility when it comes to surface water and sewage water? Because, as you know, we've had issues with flooding in towns and the finger's been pointed at Scottish Waters, when ultimately it's the local authorities' responsibility to look after surface water and roads and whatever. So do we need to have a clearer responsibility and where that falls? And will that be will that become clearer as you upgrade the Scottish Water network and the sewage works, so that it'll be clear whose responsibility various drains and and whatever are.
So I mean, I think, I'm not sure that there is such a thing as a perfect framework. Different countries tackle this issue in different ways. We have got the arrangements that we have in Scotland where there are distinct responsibilities of Scottish Water, local authorities, landowners, and so on. And at the heart of the approach enshrined in the relevant legislation is a whole notion of partnership working. And that is something that, together with other public bodies, we've got a lot better at and need to get better at into the future. So there's a lot of work we've done in conjunction with local authorities in developing integrated catchment studies. So, for example, understanding actually what are the flows of water? What are the flows of water that are unique to local authority responsibility? What are unique to Scottish Water responsibility? And what are shared between the two? Indeed, we also support local authorities with their duties in terms of their surface water management plans. I suspect the real challenge going forward is, one, to get ever better at our joint working, but also to make sure that where local authorities have got responsibilities, that they can access the finance that they need to do their upgrade work, as well as we doing ours. And equally, where the answer is doing something together, that we find ways of funding and delivering that well together. But we're in a better place than we were a few years ago, and hopefully in a few years' time we'll be better still.
Thank you. Now moving on to questions around natural infrastructure. Mark.
Yes, I mean, you've touched already on the role of natural infrastructure, and you'll be aware of the Infrastructure Commission for Scotland's report, that they feel that, you know, natural infrastructure is not being embedded enough into strategies and investment programmes. Where does it sit within your priorities? I mean, is this at the top of the hierarchy in terms of preventative spend, long-term investment, or does it in some cases go into the too difficult to do box because it's about that partnership working, it's about working on a catchment-wide basis?
So of course, as I think we mentioned it a couple of times, the nature-based solutions play a huge role in how we produce high-quality drinking water and also kind of manage surface water in day-to-day activity across Scottish Water. If you take firstly around water quality, first kind of step that we'll always look for around water quality is making sure we've got the best quality source water we possibly can to use. And that involves kind of very active catchment management for us, whether or not it's on our own catchments or in partnership with others. So in our hierarchy of decision making, for example, making sure we've got the best quality source water and managing that is pretty much top of our hierarchy. How can we control any sort of pollutant at source is far better than having to invest in kind of energy intensive treatment. So that would be very much in terms of...
So that's the case where you actually have the asset, like Loch Catrin, for example.
Yes.
But what about areas where you perhaps don't have control of surrounding land use?
Yes, so there we can work in partnership with landowners, whether it be the Forestry Commission, for example, whether or not it be people who own the catchment, peatland catchments around us. Firstly, in terms of making sure you've got fairly active management of that area. So with Forestry, for example, we've got ways that we work with them to make sure the land around the forestry land around our catchments is actively managed. Protecting the source water is a key part of any sort of management in and around the catchment. So that's actively done. And then on the other side...
So there are examples of that, but are there examples of where you're struggling to bring that sort of partnership approach together, where something perhaps like a land use strategy at a regional level or something might be more effective, or is it all plain sailing? You approach landowners, they're like, oh yes, this is great. You know,
no. There are lots of it in terms of there's lots of differences. I mean, I'd say the vast majority of the time it works very well. I think people understand, catchment owners understand the impact they have on waters and recognise that management. And SEPA, for example, have a key role on that. Sometimes it's complicated. If you look at something like the River Ugi up in the kind of northeast, for example, there's an example where there are hundreds or even thousands of individual farms and kind of catchment owners who impact in that source water. So there we're going out and being very proactive in terms of water, in terms of what we can do to protect the source waters there. But that's a lot more complicated than when we, for example, own the catchment or work very closely with other government agencies, for example, in terms of management of the catchments. There's some real proactive case studies, for example. So up on the Isle of Lewis at the moment. We've got a small treatment works at a place called North Locks, and the catchment for that, it's not owned by us, but we're working with SNH and the local catchment to improve that catchment, both for a kind of, in essence, for a carbon capture point of view, but also from a water quality perspective. And that may put off, in terms of preventative spend, that may put off investment that we need to make in that treatment works for 10, 15 years if it's successful.
Right.
So there are more and more examples of that type of investment.
Okay. And in terms of the, you know, the wider government objectives and targets for biodiversity, is that something that is directly factored in? Do you build those biodiversity outcomes or objectives rather into the outcomes for your investment strategy? Where does that sit? And is there any contradiction between investments you might make on a climate change to deliver a climate change objective, which may impact on a biodiversity, or is it all win-win all the way down?
Not I mean, if you take, first of all, we take our biodiversity duties obviously very important. We report on them in terms of our sustainability report and show examples of where, in terms of our reporting. Within our strategic plan, we're actually calling out in terms of, you know, kind of changes in our decision making into the future. So we've tended to think very focused in terms of whole life costs for investment, but much more now thinking about the kind of 6 capitals, natural and social capital contributions that any investment will also make. So that's a growing part of our investments going forward. And obviously things like peatland, for example, carbon sequestration would be a really good example. As part of our work with the Customer Forum, we've agreed that actually over the next year or so, we're actually going to do an audit of our assets and estate to really look at where the greater opportunities are for us to support biodiversity gains. And that may be, for example, allowing access into our sites or pathways through it. So that kind of natural and social capital is becoming much more as part of our decision making. And I think that's an important part of what the Infrastructure Commission also call out, is that need for wider, I think of the right phrase, but actually thinking about much more wider ways of thinking about investment decisions going forward. And they call that out as in essence a need in the investment in the Infrastructure Commission about how do we make better decisions going forward that cover not just costs but also natural and social capital.
And how does that relate to existing EU regulations? I mean, obviously EU regulations relate in part to biodiversity, they relate in part to other indicators, bacterial quality of bathing waters, etc. You know, we're in a position now where the government wishes to stay aligned, broadly speaking, to European Union regulations. But is your thinking evolving around how you balance environmental interests within that context, or?
I mean, there will be examples. So obviously we focus very strongly on terms of meeting all of our regulatory requirements and expectations on us. And a lot of those are end-of-pipe type regulations from an environment point of view. But there's much more in terms of our conversations with SEPA, for example, and how do the water sector plan within SEPA is calling out wider benefits that can be made from investment in our operations. So I think there's more and more opportunities coming forward about looking at multiple benefits of investment rather than not necessarily always be about end-of-pipe compliance.
Okay.
Thank you, Bina. It's a fairly sort of targeted supplementary question. Last year, our committee visited Inverness and saw some very interesting work where culverts were removed and there was therefore what I would describe as what looked like a burn anyway, although it was, you know, artificial to some degree, with riparian planting and biodiversity and possibilities for, I think, a day centre to be involved and in possible mental and physical well-being from that sort of surrounding. And then very briefly, another part that we saw, there was, I would say, controlled flooding was able to go into a part of a football pitch, and that had enabled there to be far less flooding further downstream. So I'm wondering, with that sort of project, the degree, even if it's not on your land or whatever, that you are involved in sort of those, what I would see as positive and semi-nature-based solutions. Are you able to be involved in those sorts of projects?
Very much so.
Yeah, I think we are. But I think we need to be careful in terms of our responsibilities, because our responsibilities primarily on the wastewater side is sewage, and therefore we want to keep that in the sewer system.
Yes.
And so I think that's our big driver around the management of surface water, is to make sure, from an economic angle as well as an environmental flooding, we keep surface water out, but crucially to keep sewage in the system so it goes safely from where somebody deposits it in their house right the way down to a treatment plant, and making sure, for example, that it's not actually overflowing onto a playing field or the like. So I think our biggest challenge actually is to reduce the extent of sewer surcharging from our sewers, which clearly is an increasing challenge with greater storm intensity. But if I come back to, I guess, to the essence of your question, then absolutely we want to work in whatever ways are appropriate in partnership with others to deliver better outcomes for communities.
So, sorry, go on.
Yeah, and I think part of our challenge, even just as we adapt the way we work in Scottish Water, is getting all the people involved in Scottish Water and this type of stuff thinking sufficiently laterally when they're doing projects, to make sure that they do take account of all the opportunities that they can help to contribute to, as well as just delivering perhaps our narrower objective.
Because I suppose, would you agree that that sort of project that I've described there is in a sense, might fall into the preventive work arrangements for you? Because it could be that the sewage would then be challenged by surface water that's,
It clearly depends on the specifics, but
yes.
it may well do.
But
I guess the key in our partnership working is, just as we might make asks of partners, they will make asks of us, and it's about how we all work together most effectively to deliver the best outcome.
And did Susan Rice, did you want to come in on that point? Or
on that
generally?
particular point, simply perhaps wearing my hat as chair of the board is that the board itself, which is a board with real governance responsibility for the company delivering its strategy, is very tuned in to these matters. It understands the strategy fully, and we have a number of non-execs who come from a range of sectors with a lot of experience, often international experience, so that the challenge that our executives receive at the board is real challenge, and it's very much informed challenge. And I hope that my colleagues would say that they find that helpful. I think these are very good discussions from that end.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Okay, I have some questions around the security of supply, quality of supply. First of all, I mean, what challenges are there in ensuring the quality of source water is, across the whole of Scotland is same standard?
Very significant, because at one level we're very fortunate, we're very blessed with the lochs and the reservoirs that we have, and the soft water that people really enjoy drinking. But actually that water itself can be full of lots of naturally occurring materials that actually, when coming into contact with the things that we need to do through a treatment process, can create byproducts. So there actually is quite a lot we just need to do in many catchments, just from a filtration and a treatment angle, to remove some of those naturally occurring elements in our source waters to make sure the water is always safe to drink. So if you like, that's kind of the stable state. Then beyond that, there's some of the wider long-term challenges that we face. For example, more intense storms causing greater runoff of material into receiving waters. And particularly, for example, if I think up in the northeast, where a lot of our water is abstracted from rivers, you just need to look at the river to see how the condition in a river can change in a very short period. And we need to make sure that our treatment plants are robust enough to cope with that variability. But then beyond that, there are occasional hazards that emerge. So a live one that we are dealing with well at the moment is a catchment where we discovered yesterday that there was some oily substance in the loch that serves a treatment plant, we trace this back to that there was effectively a breakdown between the oil tank serving somebody's AGA, and that would overtopped into the septic tank overflowed and down into the burn and into the loch. The good thing is we've got plenty of days storage in that supply, so we've turned off the treatment plant and we've got the issue contained and are managing it very well. But that's a really good example of the sort of left field hazard that we can face all the time. So we've got a really important job to do on a 24/7 basis, both in understanding what, if you like, the static environment is, but also understanding all the dynamic changes that can happen around us.
We've talked an awful lot about flood, and you've alluded to some of the issues that comes up in terms of the affecting the quality of the source water. We haven't talked about drought. And of course, you know, it wasn't that long ago, a couple of years ago, that we had that period over the summer, which did impact particularly on those maybe relying on it for like feeding their animals, etc., etc. I mean, how have you factored those kind of like historic events into your future planning in terms of ensuring we have that water supply?
Well, no, well, absolutely. So that is another element in I guess, our whole adaptation strategy for climate change that we need to take into account. How do we deal with potentially more severe and more extended periods of drought than even that we experienced in summer 2018? So that is absolutely built into our assessments of what we call the sort of water supply demand balance, where we look at what is the likely long-term demand in a particular area, what's the potential variability in supply if we got, for example, consecutive dry periods. So that will lead at times for us to improving the security of supply in particular areas. There will always be elements where actually the best and the most efficient way of doing things is just responding when the event occurs. It's not all about hard engineering. Lots of this will be just about really good response and recovery plans for when events occur. But nonetheless, because our systems face multiple hazards, whether that's drought, whether that's diesel contamination that might come in from left field, whether it's a failure of our infrastructure because of a power outage, or whether it's a major burst of power. There are lots of hazards. So because of that, what we determined is we need to build much more resilience into our water supply systems over time. And our aim over time, and this will be over a significant period, is for all large communities is to get to the point where actually they can be dual fed, where water can come from one source, or if something affects that supply side, it could come from an alternative supply side. But that is a long journey ahead. We reckon by the time we've completed our current Ayrshire Resilience Scheme in 2 to 3 years' time, that by then about a third of Scotland will be able to be dual supplied.
Right.
So a long way to go to be able to ensure that all major communities are dual supplied. But that is something we do want to address in the delivery of our strategic plan.
Yeah, and another issue, of course, is capacity of supply as well, particularly where you've got growing settlements,
Yep.
you know, expansion. I mean, I see that in my own area with Ellen,
Yep.
and you'll know about the
Indeed.
issues there. Projections are showing that there's going to be a rise in populations more towards the east of Scotland. They've obviously heard how great the east of Scotland is. But that has to be factored into your long-term plan as well, because quite a lot of those larger towns and cities in the east have only maybe one reservoir. How are you factoring that into your plans?
So I think it will be multifaceted. So we absolutely recognise that likely pressure. Firstly, we've got to keep bearing down on the leakage within our own water networks. We are now well effectively into the economic level of leakage area, and all the time we keep driving that down as we get ever more efficient at finding and fixing leaks. So we've driven year-on-year reductions in our leakage, and I think we need to keep bearing down on that over the years to come. Secondly, we need over time to encourage our customers, people of Scotland, to become ever more efficient in the use of water. Now, some of that will need to happen upstream in terms of building standards and the refurbishment of existing properties, but actually trying to, over time, engage folks in the benefits that come through water efficiency. So, for example, last summer, We held events across Scotland. We spoke to probably about 20,000 of our customers. And we wondered actually how well would people respond to that, because often the joke is it's forever raining in Scotland, so why do I need to use water wisely? But we were hugely impressed actually at the way that people could, particularly remembering back to the summer of 2018, and realise that, okay, time like February 2020, it is chucking it down, but there are other times when actually we are under water stress, and people realise we might be under more water stress in the future and realise that they need to play their part. But that, we've got a big job ahead of ourselves to encourage that in the years ahead. And then no doubt over time there'll be further discussions with particularly with SEPA around making sure that there's a fair use of water between the needs of agriculture, the needs of business, as well as the needs of the public water supply system. And indeed, finally, there may be areas where we do need to augment our supplies, for example, in terms of raising reservoir levels. One scheme that we're likely to launch shortly is to augment the water supply into the area to Inverness and out along the A96 corridor to the east, because of all the growth there. And the two lochs that effectively sit above Loch Ness to the south that supply Inverness may not have enough water in a really dry year to cope with future demand. So we're likely to shortly launch a scheme to actually abstract from Loch Ness to supplement our existing supplies. So that would be a good example of the ways in which we're thinking and planning ahead to make sure we can support growth, even in the context of a more challenging climate.
Okay, thank you for that. Finn, you have some questions on that?
Yeah, just very, very quickly in the back of that, you know, we're potentially looking at more stress on the and demand on the water network going forward, and with a view to tackling climate change and more efficient use of resources. Businesses already are metered, commercial properties are metered. Can you see in the future, if your ambitions to make the public more aware of water wastage, can you see in the future that individual metering of water usage might be brought in?
I mean, that's very much a policy matter for the Scottish Government for a whole variety of reasons. Their current policy position is to support household charging being primarily linked to council tax band, albeit if a household wants a meter, then we will install one, albeit they need to pay for that. I mean, you can never say never to anything that might need to change from policy angle, particularly when one looks decades ahead. But based on current metering infrastructure and costs, it's actually quite an expensive addition into the infrastructure. I know the economic regulator in England, Ofwat, did some work a few years ago and reckoned that the cost of installing, maintaining and reading meters add an average about £50 a year to the average household bill. So what I do know is the system that we have in Scotland for charging, apart from all the benefits I think it gives from a kind of a social protection angle, it also is inherently lower cost for all customers. But who knows what the future might bring, who knows what technologies might be available. And if it's proven that actually people understanding the usage helps to drive down consumption, then perhaps. However, what we're doing at the moment is we're very much tapping in through work we're doing with the Energy Saving Trust to look at the position where probably about a quarter of the energy bill in a home is used in heating water. So actually the route we're trying to take at the moment is to raise awareness of that linkage between use of water and use of energy and the energy bill. And if you look at the relative size of energy bills compared to water bills, actually there's far more saving for households in driving down their energy consumption through smarter use of hot water than they will probably ever achieve in reducing their water charges because of the very fixed cost nature of our water supply system.
Interesting.
Yes.
Back to Mark's point about land use strategy with regard to linking that to the water treatment plants. Has there ever been any work done on whether, for example, planting trees mitigates against acidification and therefore then puts less pressure on your water treatment plants?
There's a trend that we're seeing, and it's not just us across Northern Europe, for example, about deacidification. So the benefits we've got from cleaning up the atmosphere have actually led to changes in the pH of raw waters and more organics coming in. So a side impact of all that investment many years ago to clean those up. So there is, in terms of a link between forestry, for example, and acidification, not necessarily. The biggest change we see is atmospheric on that one. The benefits, though, come is, if you take, for example, the last year, we've seen challenges into our water treatment works and into our source waters because of wash off from our catchments, particles being washed off into our reservoirs. And we know forestry and certain kind of practices around that can actually slow that down. So there is benefits associated with, you know, good forestry management practices in and around our actual catchments. So not necessarily a direct link in that way, but any sort of good catchment management, which is linked to providing and kind of managing the risks on our source waters, we'd welcome.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. I want to thank you for your time this morning. Unless any other members have any other questions, I think we have exhausted our lines of questioning. Thank you for coming in. I should also mention that I neglected to give apologies this morning from Stuart Stevenson and Angus MacDonald, so I'm putting that on the record now. That concludes the committee's business in public today. At its next meeting on the 3rd of March, the committee will take evidence on the draft regulations establishing a register of persons holding a controlled interest in land and draft regulations on the right to buy land to further sustainable development. And we'll now move into private session, and I ask that the gallery be cleared as this public part of the meeting is now over. Thank you.